KPSS, the Bolshevik Party in the struggle for the socialist industrialization of the country. 1926-1929. 1. Difficulties in the period of socialist industrialization and the fight to overcome them. Formation of the anti-party bloc of Trotskyists and Zinovievites. Anti-Soviet actions of the bloc. Defeat of the bloc. After the 14th Congress, the party launched a vigorous struggle for the realization of the general line of the Soviet government. The socialist industrialization of the country. In the Restoration period, the task had been to revive agriculture before all else, so as to obtain raw materials and foodstuffs, to restore and to set going the industries, the existing mills and factories. The Soviet government coped with this task with comparative ease. But in the Restoration period there were three major shortcomings. First, the mills and factories were old, equipped with worn-out and antiquated machinery, and might soon go out of commission. The task now was to re-equip them on up-to-date lines. Secondly, industry in the Restoration period rested on too narrow a foundation. It lacked machine-building plants absolutely indispensable to the country. Hundreds of these plants had to be built, for without them no country can be considered as being really industrialized. The task now was to build these plants and to equip them on up-to-date lines. Thirdly, the industries in this period were mostly light industries. These were developed and put on their feet. But, beyond a certain point, the further development even of the light industries met an obstacle in the weakness of heavy industry, not to mention the fact that the country had other requirements which could be satisfied only by a well-developed heavy industry. The task now was to tip the scales in favor of heavy industry. All these new tasks were to be accomplished by the policy of socialist industrialization. It was necessary to build up a large number of new industries, industries which had not existed in Tsarist Russia, new machinery, machine 280. Tool, automobile, chemical, and iron and steel plants, to organize the production of engines and power equipment, and to increase the mining of ore and coal. This was essential for the victory of socialism in the USSR. It was necessary to create a new munitions industry, to erect new works for the production of artillery, shells, aircraft, tanks and machine guns. This was essential for the defense of the USSR, surrounded as it was by a capitalist world. It was necessary to build tractor works and plants for the production of modern agricultural machinery, and to furnish agriculture with these machines, so as to enable millions of small individual peasant farms to pass to large-scale collective farming. This was essential for the victory of socialism in the countryside. All this was to be achieved by the policy of industrialization, for that is what the socialist industrialization of the country meant. Clearly, construction work on so large a scale would necessitate the investment of thousands of millions of rubles. To count on foreign loans was out of the question, for the capitalist countries refused to grant loans. We had to build with our own resources, without foreign assistance. But we were then a poor country. There lay one of the chief difficulties. Capitalist countries as a rule built up their heavy industries with funds obtained from abroad, whether by colonial plunder, or by exacting indemnities from vanquished nations, or else by foreign loans. The Soviet Union could not as a matter of principle resort to such infamous means of obtaining funds as the plunder of colonies or of vanquished nations. As for foreign loans, that avenue was closed to the USSR, as the capitalist countries refused to lend it anything. The funds had to be found inside the country. And they were found. Financial sources were tapped in the USSR, such as could not be tapped in any capitalist country. The Soviet state had taken over all the mills, factories, and lands which the October Socialist Revolution had wrested from the capitalists and landlords, all the means of transportation, the banks, and home and foreign trade. The profits from the state-owned mills and factories, and from the means of transportation, trade and the banks now went to further the expansion of industry, and not into the pockets of a parasitic capitalist class. The Soviet government had annulled the Tsarist debts, on which the people had annually paid hundreds of millions of gold rubles in interest alone. By abolishing the right of the landlords to the land, the Soviet government had freed the peasantry from the annual payment of about 500 million gold rubles in rent. Released from this burden, the peasantry was in a position to help the state to build a new and powerful industry. The peasants had a vital interest in obtaining tractors and other agricultural machinery. All these sources of revenue were in the hands of the Soviet state. They could yield hundreds and thousands of millions of rubles for the creation of a heavy industry. All that was needed was a business-like approach, the strictly economical expenditure of funds, rationalization of industry, reduction of costs of production, elimination of unproductive expenditure, etc. And this was the course the Soviet government adopted. Thanks to a regime of strict economy, the funds available for capital development increased from year to year. This made it possible to start on gigantic construction works like the Dnieper hydroelectric power station, the Turkestan-Siberian Railway, the Stalingrad tractor works, a number of machine tool works, the AMO, ZIS, automobile works and others. Whereas in 1926-27 about 1 billion rubles were invested in industry, 3 years later it was found possible to invest about 5 billion rubles. Industrialization was making steady headway. The capitalist countries looked upon the growing strength of the socialist economic system in the USSR as a threat to the existence of the capitalist system. Accordingly, the imperialist governments did everything they could to bring new pressure to bear on the USSR, to create a feeling of uncertainty and uneasiness in the country, and to frustrate, or at least to impede, the industrialization of the USSR. In May 1927, the British conservative diehards, then in office, organized a provocative raid on Arcos, the Soviet trading body in Great Britain. On May 26, 1927, the British conservative government broke off diplomatic and trade relations with the USSR. On June 7, 1927, Comrade Voykov, the Soviet ambassador in Warsaw, was assassinated by a Russian White Guard, a naturalized Polish subject. About this time, too, in the USSR itself, British spies and diversionists hurled bombs at a meeting in a party club in Leningrad, wounding about 30 people, some of them severely. In the summer of 1927, almost simultaneous raids were made on the Soviet embassies and trade representations in Berlin, Peking, Shanghai and Tientsin. This created additional difficulties for the Soviet government. But the USSR refused to be intimidated and easily repulsed the provocative attempts of the imperialists and their agents. No less were the difficulties caused to the party and the Soviet state by the subversive activities of the Trotskyites and other oppositionists. Comrade Stalin had good reason to say that something like a united front from Chamberlain to Trotsky is being formed against the Soviet government. In spite of the decisions of the 14th Party, Congress and the professions of loyalty of the oppositionists, the latter had not laid down their arms. On the contrary, they intensified their efforts to undermine and split the party. In the summer of 1926, the Trotskyites and Zinovivites united to form an anti-party bloc, made it a rallying point for the remnants of all the defeated opposition groups, and laid the foundation of their secret anti-Leninist party, thereby grossly violating the party rules and the decisions of party congresses forbidding the formation of factions. The Central Committee of the party gave warning that unless this anti-party bloc, which resembled the notorious Menshevik August bloc, were dissolved, matters might end badly for its adherents. But the supporters of the bloc would not desist. That autumn, on the eve of the 15th Party Conference, they made a sortie at party meetings in the factories of Moscow, Leningrad and other cities, attempting to force a new discussion on the party. The platform they tried to get the party members to discuss was a rehash of the usual Trotskyite Menshevik anti-Leninist platform. The party members gave the oppositionists a severe rebuff, and in some places simply ejected them from the meetings. The Central Committee again warned the supporters of the bloc, stating that the party could not tolerate their subversive activities any longer. The opposition then submitted to the Central Committee a statement signed by Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev and Sokolnikov condemning their own factional work and promising to be loyal in the future. Nevertheless, the bloc continued to exist and its adherents did not stop their underhand work against the party. They went on banding together their anti-Leninist party, started an illegal printing press, collected membership dues from their supporters and circulated their platform. In view of the behavior of the Trotskyites and Zinovievites, the 15th Party Conference, November 1926, and the enlarged plenum of the Executive Committee of the Communist International, December 1926, discussed the question of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites and adopted resolutions stigmatizing the adherents of this bloc as splitters whose platform was downright Menshevism. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. But even this failed to bring them to their senses. In 1927, just when the British conservatives broke off diplomatic and trade relations with the USSR, the bloc attacked the party with renewed vigor. It concocted a new anti-Leninist platform, the so-called Platform of the 83, and began to circulate it among party members, at the same time demanding that the Central Committee open a new general party discussion. This was perhaps the most mendacious and pharisaical of all opposition platforms. In their platform, the Trotskyites and Zinovievites professed that they had no objection to observing party decisions and that they were all in favor of loyalty, but in reality they grossly violated the party decisions, and scoffed at the very idea of loyalty to the party and to its Central Committee. In their platform, they professed they had no objection to party unity and were against splits, but in reality they grossly violated party unity, worked for a split, and already had their own, illegal, anti-Leninist party which had all the makings of an anti-Soviet, counter-revolutionary party. In their platform, they professed they were all in favor of the policy of industrialization, and even accused the Central Committee of not proceeding with industrialization fast enough, but in reality they did nothing but carp at the party resolution on the victory of socialism in the USSR, scoffed at the policy of socialist industrialization, demanded the surrender of a number of mills and factories to foreigners in the form of concessions, and pinned their main hopes on foreign capitalist concessions in the USSR. In their platform, they professed they were all in favor of the collective farm movement, and even accused the Central Committee of not proceeding with collectivization fast enough. But in reality they scoffed at the policy of enlisting the peasants in the work of socialist construction, preached the idea that unresolvable conflicts between the working class and the peasantry were inevitable, and pinned their hopes on the cultured leaseholders in the countryside, in other words, on the kulaks. This was the most mendacious of all the platforms of the opposition. It was meant to deceive the party. The Central Committee refused to open a general discussion immediately. It informed the opposition that a general discussion could be opened only in accordance with the party rules, namely, 2 months before a party congress. In October 1927, that is, 2 months before the 15th Congress, the Central Committee of the party announced a general party discussion, and the fight began. Its result was truly lamentable for the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovivites. 724,000 party members voted for the policy of the Central Committee, 4,000, or less than 1%, for the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovivites. The anti-party bloc was completely routed. The overwhelming majority of the party members were unanimous in rejecting the platform of the bloc. Such was the clearly expressed will of the party, for whose judgment the oppositionists themselves had appealed. But even this lesson was lost on the supporters of the bloc. Instead of submitting to the will of the party, they decided to frustrate it. Even before the discussion had closed, perceiving that ignominious failure awaited them, they decided to resort to more acute forms of struggle against the party and the Soviet government and to stage an open demonstration of protest in Moscow and Leningrad. The day they chose for their demonstration was November 7, the anniversary of the October Revolution, the day on which the working people of the USSR annually hold their countrywide revolutionary demonstration. Thus, the Trotskyites and Zinovivites planned to hold a parallel demonstration. As was to be expected, the supporters of the bloc managed to bring out into the streets only a miserable handful of their satellites. These satellites and their patrons were overwhelmed by the general demonstration and swept off the streets. Now there was no longer any doubt that the Trotskyites and Zinovivites had become definitely anti-Soviet. During the general party discussion they had appealed to the party against the Central Committee. Now, during their puny demonstration, they had taken the course of appealing to the hostile classes against the party and the Soviet state. Once they had made it their aim to undermine the Bolshevik party, they were bound to go to the length of undermining the Soviet state, for in the Soviet Union the Bolshevik party and the state are inseparable. That being the case, the ringleaders of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovivites had outlawed themselves from the party, for men who had sunk to the depths of anti-Soviet action could no longer be tolerated in the ranks of the Bolshevik party. On November 14, 1927, a joint meeting of the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission expelled Trotsky and Zinoviev from the party. 2. Progress of Socialist Industrialization. Agriculture. Lags. 15th Party Congress. Policy of collectivization in agriculture. Rout of the bloc of TSK and ZINOVIEVITES, political duplicity. By the end of 1927, the decisive success of the policy of socialist industrialization was unmistakable. Under the new economic policy, industrialization had made considerable progress in a short space of time. The gross output of industry and agriculture, including the timber industry and fisheries, had reached and even surpassed the pre-war level. Industrial output had risen to 42% of the total output of the country, which was the pre-war ratio. The socialist sector of industry was rapidly growing at the expense of the private sector, its output having risen from 81% of the total output in 1924-25 to 86% in 1926-27, the output of the private sector dropping from 19% to 14% in the same period. This meant that industrialization in the USSR was of a pronounced socialist character, that industry was developing towards the victory of the socialist system of production, and that as far as industry was concerned, the question, who will win, had already been decided in favor of socialism. No less rapid was the displacement of the private dealer in the sphere of trade, his share in the retail market having fallen from 42% in 1924-25 to 32% in 1926-27, not to mention the wholesale market, where the share of the private dealer had fallen from 9% to 5% in the same period. Even more rapid was the rate of growth of large-scale socialist industry, which in 1927, the first year after the Restoration period, increased its output over the previous year by 18%. This was a record increase, one beyond the reach of the large-scale industry of even the most advanced capitalist countries. But in agriculture, especially grain growing, the picture was different. Although agriculture as a whole had passed the pre-war level, the gross yield of its most important branch, grain growing, was only 91% of pre-war, while the marketed share of the harvest, that is, the amount of grain sold for the supply of the towns, scarcely attained 37% of the pre-war figure. Furthermore, all the signs pointed to the danger of a further decline in the amount of marketable grain. This meant that the process of the splitting up of the large farms that used to produce for the market into small farms, and of the small farms into dwarf farms, a process which had begun in 1918, was still going on. That these small and dwarf peasant farms were reverting practically to a natural form of economy and were able to supply only a negligible quantity of grain for the market. That while in the 1927 period the grain crop was only slightly below that of the pre-war period, the marketable surplus for the supply of the towns was only a little more than one-third of the pre-war marketable surplus. There could be no doubt that if such a state of affairs in grain farming were to continue, the army and the urban population would be faced with chronic famine. This was a crisis in grain farming which was bound to be followed by a crisis in livestock farming. The only escape from this predicament was a change to large-scale farming which would permit the use of tractors and agricultural machines and secure a several-fold increase of the marketable surplus of grain. The country had the alternative, either to adopt large-scale capitalist farming, which would have meant the ruin of the peasant masses, destroyed the alliance between the working class and the peasantry, increased the strength of the kulaks, and led to the downfall of socialism in the countryside, or to take the course of amalgamating the small peasant holdings into large socialist farms, collective farms, which would be able to use tractors and other modern machines for a rapid advancement of grain farming and a rapid increase in the marketable surplus of grain. It is clear that the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state could only take the second course, the collective farm way of developing agriculture. In this, the party was guided by the following precepts of Lenin regarding the necessity of passing from small peasant farming to large-scale, cooperative, collective farming. A. There is no escape from poverty for the small farm, Lenin. Selected Works, Volume 8, page 195. B. If we continue as of old on our small farms, even as free citizens on free land, we shall still be faced with inevitable ruin. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 6, page 370. C. If peasant farming is to develop further, we must firmly assure also its transition to the next stage, and this next stage must inevitably be one in which the small, isolated peasant farms, the least profitable and most backward, will by a process of gradual amalgamation form large-scale collective farms. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 9, page 151. D. Only if we succeed in proving to the peasants in practice the advantages of common, collective, cooperative, artel cultivation of the soil, only if we succeed in helping the peasant by means of cooperative or artel farming, will the working class, which holds the state power, be really able to convince the peasant of the correctness of its policy and to secure the real and durable following of the millions of peasants. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 8, page 198. Such was the situation prior to the 15th Party Congress. The 15th Party Congress opened on December 2, 1927. It was attended by 898 delegates with vote and 771 delegates with voice but no vote, representing 887,233 party members and 348,957 candidate members. In his report on behalf of the Central Committee, Comrade Stalin referred to the good results of industrialization and the rapid expansion of socialist industry, and set the party the following task: to extend and consolidate our socialist key position in all economic branches in town and country, and to pursue a course of eliminating the capitalist elements from the national economy. Comparing agriculture with industry and noting the backwardness of the former, especially of grain growing, owing to the scattered state of agriculture, which precluded the use of modern machinery, Comrade Stalin emphasized that such an unenviable state of agriculture was endangering the entire national economy. What is the way out? Comrade Stalin asked. The way out, he said, is to turn the small and scattered peasant farms into large united farms based on the common cultivation of the soil, to introduce collective cultivation of the soil on the basis of a new and higher technique. The way out is to unite the small and dwarf peasant farms gradually but surely, not by pressure, but by example and persuasion, into large farms based on common, cooperative, collective cultivation of the soil with the use of agricultural machines and tractors and scientific methods of intensive agriculture. There is no other way out. The 15th Congress passed a resolution calling for the fullest development of collectivization in agriculture. The Congress adopted a plan for the extension and consolidation of the collective farms and state farms and formulated explicit instructions concerning the methods to be used in the struggle for collectivization in agriculture. At the same time, the Congress gave directions to develop further the offensive against the kulaks and to adopt a number of new measures which would restrict the development of capitalism in the countryside and guide peasant farming towards socialism. Resolutions of the CPSU, B. Russ. ed. Part 2, page 260. Finally, in view of the fact that economic planning had taken firm root, and with the object of organizing a systematic offensive of socialism against the capitalist elements along the entire economic front, the Congress gave instructions to the proper bodies for the drawing up of the first 5-year plan for the development of the national economy. After passing decisions on the problems of socialist construction, the Congress proceeded to discuss the question of liquidating the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovivites. The Congress recognized that the opposition has ideologically broken with Leninism, has degenerated into a Menshevik group, has taken the course of capitulation to the forces of the international and home bourgeoisie, and has objectively become a tool of counter-revolution against the regime of the proletarian dictatorship. Ibid. Page 232. The Congress found that the differences between the party and the opposition had developed into differences of program, and that the Trotsky opposition had taken the course of struggle against the Soviet power. The Congress therefore declared that adherence to the Trotsky opposition and the propagation of its views were incompatible with membership of the Bolshevik Party. The Congress approved the decision of the joint meeting of the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission to expel Trotsky and Zinoviev from the party and resolved on the expulsion of all active members of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites, such as Radek, Preobrazhensky, Rakovsky, Pyatakov, Serebryakov, I. Smirnov, Kamenev, Sarkis, Safarov, Lifshitz, Mdivani, Smilga and the whole Democratic Centralism Group, Sapronov, V. Smirnov, Bogoslavsky, Drobnis and others. Defeated ideologically and routed organizationally, the adherents of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites lost the last vestiges of their influence among the people. Shortly after the 15th Party Congress, the expelled anti-Leninists began to hand in statements, recanting Trotskyism and asking to be reinstated in the party. Of course, at that time the party could not yet know that Trotsky, Rakovsky, Radek, Krestinsky, Sokolnikov, and others had long been enemies of the people, spies recruited by foreign espionage services, and that Kamenev, Zinoviev, Pyatakov and others were already forming connections with enemies of the USSR in capitalist countries for the purpose of collaboration with them against the Soviet people. But experience had taught the party that any knavery might be expected from these individuals, who had often attacked Lenin and the Leninist party at the most crucial moments. It was therefore skeptical of the statements they had made in their applications for reinstatement. As a preliminary test of their sincerity, it made their reinstatement in the party dependent on the following conditions. A. They must publicly denounce Trotskyism as an anti-Bolshevik and anti-Soviet ideology. B. They must publicly acknowledge the party policy as the only correct policy. C. They must unconditionally abide by the decisions of the party and its bodies. D. They must undergo a term of probation, during which the party would test them. On the expiration of this term, the party would consider the reinstatement of each applicant separately, depending on the results of the test. The party considered that in any case the public acceptance of these points by the expelled would be all to the good of the party, because it would break the unity of the Trotskyite-Zinovievite ranks, undermine their morale, demonstrate once more the right and the might of the party, and enable the party, if the applicants were sincere, to reinstate its former workers in its ranks, and if they were not sincere, to unmask them in the public eye, no longer as misguided individuals, but as unprincipled careerists, deceivers of the working class and incorrigible double-dealers. The majority of the expelled accepted the terms of reinstatement and made public statements in the press to this effect. Desiring to be clement to them, and loath to deny them an opportunity of once again becoming men of the party and of the working class, the party reinstated them in its ranks. However, time showed that, with few exceptions, the recantations of the leading lights of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites were false and hypocritical from beginning to end. It turned out that even before they had handed in their applications, these gentry had ceased to represent a political trend ready to defend their views before the people, and had become an unprincipled gang of careerists who were prepared publicly to trample on the last remnants of their own views, publicly to praise the views of the party, which were alien to them, and, like chameleons, to adopt any coloring, provided they could maintain themselves in the ranks of the party and the working class and have the opportunity to do harm to the working class and to its party. The leading lights of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites proved to be political swindlers, political double-dealers. Political double-dealers usually begin with deceit and prosecute their nefarious ends by deceiving the people, the working class, and the party of the working class. But political double-dealers are not to be regarded as mere humbugs. Political double-dealers are an unprincipled gang of political careerists who, having long ago lost the confidence of the people, strive to insinuate themselves once more into their confidence by deception, by chameleon-like changes of color, by fraud, by any means, only that they might retain the title of political figures. Political double-dealers are an unprincipled gang of political careerists who are ready to seek support anywhere, even among criminal elements, even among the scum of society, even among the mortal enemies of the people, only that they might be able, at a propitious moment, again to mount the political stage and to clamber onto the back of the people as their rulers. The leading lights of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites were political double-dealers of this very description. 3. Offensive against the kulaks. The Bukharin-Rykov anti-party group. Adoption of the first 5-year plan. Socialist emulation. Beginning of the mass COLLECTIVE farm movement. The agitation conducted by the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovivites against the party policy, against the building of socialism, and against collectivization, as well as the agitation conducted by the Bukharinites, who said that nothing would come of the collective farms, that the kulaks should be let alone because they would grow into socialism of themselves, and that the enrichment of the bourgeoisie represented no danger to socialism, all found an eager response among the capitalist elements in the country, and above all among the kulaks. The kulaks now knew from comments in the press that they were not alone, that they had defenders and intercessors in the persons of Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov and others. Naturally, this could not but stiffen the kulaks' spirit of resistance against the policy of the Soviet government. And, in fact, the resistance of the kulaks became increasingly stubborn. They refused en masse to sell to the Soviet state their grain surpluses, of which they had considerable hoards. They resorted to terrorism against the collective farmers, against party workers and government officials in the countryside, and burned down collective farms and state granaries. The party realized that until the resistance of the kulaks was broken, until they were defeated in open fight in full view of the peasantry, the working class and the Red Army would suffer from a food shortage, and the movement for collectivization among the peasants could not assume a mass character. In pursuance of the instructions of the 15th Party Congress, the party launched a determined offensive against the kulaks, putting into effect the slogan, "Rely firmly on the poor peasantry, strengthen the alliance with the middle peasantry, and wage a resolute struggle against the kulaks." In answer to the kulaks' refusal to sell their grain surpluses to the state at the fixed prices, the party and the government adopted a number of emergency measures against the kulaks, applied Article 107 of the Criminal Code empowering the courts to confiscate grain surpluses from kulaks and profiteers in case they refused to sell them to the state at the fixed prices, and granted the poor peasants a number of privileges, under which 25% of the confiscated kulak grain was placed at their disposal. These emergency measures had their effect. The poor and middle peasants joined in the resolute fight against the kulaks. The kulaks were isolated, and the resistance of the kulaks and the profiteers was broken. By the end of 1928, the Soviet state already had sufficient stocks of grain at its disposal, and the collective farm movement began to advance with surer strides. That same year, a large organization of wreckers, consisting of bourgeois experts, was discovered in the Shakhty district of the Donets coal basin. The Shakhty wreckers were closely connected with the former mine owners, Russian and foreign capitalists, and with the foreign military espionage service. Their aim was to disrupt the development of socialist industry and to facilitate the restoration of capitalism in the USSR. The wreckers had deliberately mismanaged the mines in order to reduce the output of coal, spoiled machinery and ventilation apparatus, caused roof falls and explosions, and set fire to pits, plants and power stations. The wreckers had deliberately obstructed the improvement of the workers' conditions and had infringed the Soviet labor protection laws. The wreckers were put on trial and met with their deserts. The Central Committee of the party directed all party organizations to draw the necessary conclusions from the Shakhty case. Comrade Stalin declared that Bolshevik business executives must themselves become experts in the technique of production, so as no longer to be the dupes of the wreckers among the old bourgeois experts, and that the training of new technical personnel from the ranks of the working class must be accelerated. In accordance with a decision of the Central Committee, the training of young experts in the technical colleges was improved. Thousands of party members, members of the Young Communist League and non-party people devoted to the cause of the working class were mobilized for study. Before the party took the offensive against the kulaks, and while it was engaged in liquidating the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites, the Bukharin-Rykov group had been more or less lying low, holding themselves as a reserve of the anti-party forces, not venturing to support the Trotskyites openly, and sometimes even acting together with the party against the Trotskyites. But when the party assumed the offensive against the kulaks, and adopted emergency measures against them, the Bukharin-Rykov group threw off their mask and began to attack the party policy openly. The kulak soul of the Bukharin-Rykov group got the better of them, and they began to come out openly in defense of the kulaks. They demanded the repeal of the emergency measures, frightening the simple-minded with the argument that otherwise agriculture would begin to decay, and even affirming that this process had already begun. Blind to the growth of the collective farms and state farms, those superior forms of agricultural organization, and perceiving the decline of kulak farming, they represented the decay of the latter as the decay of agriculture. In order to provide a theoretical backing for their case, they concocted the absurd theory of the subsidence of the class struggle, maintaining, on the strength of this theory, that the class struggle would grow milder with every victory gained by socialism against the capitalist elements, that the class struggle would soon subside altogether and the class enemy would surrender all his positions without a fight, and that, consequently, there was no need for an offensive against the kulaks. In this way they tried to furbish up their threadbare bourgeois theory that the kulaks would peaceably grow into socialism, and rode roughshod over the well-known thesis of Leninism that the resistance of the class enemy would assume more acute forms as the progress of socialism cut the ground from under his feet, and that the class struggle could subside only after the class enemy was destroyed. It was easy to see that in the Bukharin-Rykov group the party was faced with a group of right opportunists who differed from the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites only in form, only in the fact that the Trotskyite and Zinovievite capitulators had had some opportunity of masking their true nature with left, revolutionary vociferations about permanent revolution, whereas the Bukharin-Rykov group, attacking the party as they did for taking the offensive against the kulaks, could not possibly mask their capitulatory character and had to defend the reactionary forces in our country, the kulaks in particular, openly, without mask or disguise. The party understood that sooner or later the Bukharin-Rykov group was bound to join hands with the remnants of the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites for common action against the party. Parallel with their political pronouncements, the Bukharin-Rykov group worked to muster and organize their following. Through Bukharin, they banded together young bourgeois elements like Slepkov, Moretsky, Eichenwald, Goldenberg; through Tomsky, high bureaucrats in the trade unions, Melnichansky, Dogodov and others; through Rykov, demoralized high Soviet officials, A. Smirnov, Eisment, V. Schmidt, and others. The group readily attracted people who had degenerated politically, and who made no secret of their capitulatory sentiments. About this time the Bukharin-Rykov group gained the support of high functionaries in the Moscow party organization, Uglanov, Kotov, Yukhanov, Ryutin, Yagoda, Polonsky, and others. A section of the rights kept under cover, abstaining from open attacks on the party line. In the Moscow party press and at party meetings, it was advocated that concessions must be made to the kulaks, that heavy taxation of kulaks was inadvisable, that industrialization was burdensome to the people, and that the development of heavy industry was premature. Uglanov opposed the Dnieper hydroelectric scheme and demanded that funds be diverted from heavy industry to the light industries. Uglanov and the other right capitulators maintained that Moscow was and would remain a gingham city, and that there was no need to build engineering works in Moscow. The Moscow party organization unmasked Uglanov and his followers, gave them a final warning and rallied closer than ever around the Central Committee of the party. At a plenary meeting of the Moscow Committee of the CPSU, held in 1928, Comrade Stalin said that a fight must be waged on two fronts, with the fire concentrated on the right deviation. The rights, Comrade Stalin said, were kulak agents inside the party. The triumph of the right deviation in our party would unleash the forces of capitalism, undermine the revolutionary position of the proletariat and increase the chances of restoring capitalism in our country, said Comrade Stalin. Stalin, Leninism, Volume 2. At the beginning of 1929 it was discovered that Bukharin, authorized by the group of right capitulators, had formed connections with the Trotskyites, through Kamenev, and was negotiating an agreement with them for a joint struggle against the party. The Central Committee exposed these criminal activities of the right capitulators and warned them that this affair might end lamentably for Bukharin, Rykov, Tomsky and the rest. But the right capitulators would not heed the warning. At a meeting of the Central Committee they advanced a new anti-party platform, in the form of a declaration, which the Central Committee condemned. It warned them again, reminding them of what had happened to the bloc of Trotskyites and Zinovievites. In spite of this, the Bukharin-Rykov group persisted in their anti-party activities. Rykov, Tomsky and Bukharin tendered to the Central Committee their resignations, believing that they would intimidate the party thereby. The Central Committee passed condemnation on this saboteur policy of resignations. Finally, a plenum of the Central Committee, held in November 1929, declared that the propaganda of the views of the right opportunists was incompatible with membership of the party. It resolved that Bukharin, as the instigator and leader of the right capitulators, be removed from the political bureau of the Central Committee, and issued a grave warning to Rykov, Tomsky and other members of the right opposition. Perceiving that matters had taken a lamentable turn, the chieftains of the right capitulators submitted a statement acknowledging their errors and the correctness of the political line of the party. The right capitulators decided to effect a temporary retreat so as to preserve their ranks from debacle. This ended the first stage of the party's fight against the right capitulators. The new differences within the party did not escape the attention of the external enemies of the Soviet Union. Believing that the new dissensions in the party were a sign of its weakness, they made a new attempt to involve the USSR in war and to thwart the work of industrialization before it had got properly underway. In the summer of 1929, the imperialists provoked a conflict between China and the Soviet Union, and instigated the seizure of the Chinese Eastern Railway, which belonged to the USSR, by the Chinese militarists, and an attack on our far eastern frontier by troops of the Chinese Whites. But this raid of the Chinese militarists was promptly liquidated. The militarists, routed by the Red Army, retreated and the conflict ended in the signing of a peace agreement with the Manchurian authorities. The peace policy of the USSR once more triumphed in the face of all obstacles, notwithstanding the intrigues of external enemies and the dissensions within the party. Soon after this, diplomatic and trade relations between the USSR and Great Britain, which had been severed by the British Conservatives, were resumed. While successfully repulsing the attacks of the external and internal enemies, the party was busily engaged in developing heavy industry, organizing socialist emulation, building up state farms and collective farms, and, lastly, preparing the ground for the adoption and execution of the first five-year plan for the development of the national economy. In April 1929, the party held its 16th conference with the first five-year plan as the main item on the agenda. The conference rejected the minimal variant of the five-year plan advocated by the right capitulators and adopted the optimal variant as binding under all circumstances. Thus, the party adopted the celebrated first five-year plan for the construction of socialism. The five-year plan fixed the volume of capital investments in the national economy in the period 1928 to 33 at 64,600,000,000 rubles. Of this sum, 19,500,000,000 rubles were to be invested in industrial and electric power development, 10 billion rubles in transport development and 23,200,000,000 rubles in agriculture. This was a colossal plan for the equipment of industry and agriculture of the USSR with modern technique. The fundamental task of the five-year plan, said Comrade Stalin, was to create such an industry in our country as would be able to re-equip and reorganize, not only the whole of industry, but also transport and agriculture, on the basis of socialism. Stalin, Problems of Leninism, Rus. ed. Page 485. For all the immensity of this plan, it did not nonplus or surprise the Bolsheviks. The way for it had been prepared by the whole course of development of industrialization and collectivization, and it had been preceded by a wave of labor enthusiasm which caught up the workers and peasants and which found expression in socialist emulation. The 16th Party Conference adopted an appeal to all working people, calling for the further development of socialist emulation. Socialist emulation had produced many an instance of exemplary labor and of a new attitude to labor. In many factories, collective farms and state farms, the workers and collective farmers drew up counterplans for an output exceeding that provided for in the state plans. They displayed heroism in labor. They not only fulfilled, but exceeded the plans of socialist development laid down by the party and the government. The attitude to labor had changed. From the involuntary and penal servitude it had been under capitalism, it was becoming a matter of honor, a matter of glory, a matter of valor and heroism. Stalin. New industrial construction on a gigantic scale was in progress all over the country. The Dnieper hydroelectric scheme was in full swing. Construction work on the Kramatorsk and Gorlovka iron and steel works and the reconstruction of the Lugansk locomotive works had begun in the Donets Basin. New collieries and blast furnaces came into being. The Urals machine building works and the Berezniki and Solikamsk chemical works were under construction in the Urals. Work was begun on the construction of the iron and steel mills of Magnitogorsk. The erection of big automobile plants in Moscow and Gorky was well underway, as was the construction of giant tractor plants, harvester combined plants, and a mammoth agricultural machinery plant in Rostov-on-Don. The Kuznetsk collieries, the Soviet Union's second coal base, were being extended. An immense tractor works sprang up in the steppe near Stalingrad in the space of 11 months. In the erection of the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Stalingrad tractor works, the workers beat world records in productivity of labor. History had never known industrial construction on such a gigantic scale, such enthusiasm for new development, such labor heroism on the part of the working class millions. It was a veritable upsurge of labor enthusiasm, produced and stimulated by socialist emulation. This time the peasants did not lag behind the workers. In the countryside, too, this labor enthusiasm began to spread among the peasant masses who were organizing their collective farms. The peasants definitely began to turn to collective farming. In this a great part was played by the state farms and the machine and tractor stations. The peasants would come in crowds to the state farms and machine and tractor stations to watch the operation of the tractors and other agricultural machines, admire their performance and there and then resolve. Let's join the collective farm. Divided and disunited, each on his tiny, dwarf individually run farm, destitute of anything like serviceable implements or traction, having no way of breaking up large tracts of virgin soil, without prospect of any improvement on their farms, crushed by poverty, isolated and left to their own devices, the peasants had at last found a way out, an avenue to a better life, in the amalgamation of their small farms into cooperative undertakings, collective farms, in tractors, which are able to break up any hard ground, any virgin soil. In the assistance rendered by the state in the form of machines, money, men, and counsel, in the opportunity to free themselves from bondage to the kulaks, who had been quite recently defeated by the Soviet government and forced to the ground, to the joy of the millions of peasants. On this basis began the mass collective farm movement, which later developed rapidly, especially towards the end of 1929, progressing at an unprecedented rate, a rate unknown even to our socialist industry. In 1928, the total crop area of the collective farms was 1,390,000 hectares, in 1929 it was 4,262,000 hectares, while in 1930 the plowing plan of the collective farms was already 15 million hectares. It must be admitted, said Comrade Stalin in his article, A Year of Great Change, 1929, in reference to the collective farms, that such an impetuous speed of development is unequaled even in our socialized large-scale industry, which in general is noted for its outstanding speed of development. This was a turning point in the development of the collective farm movement. This was the beginning of a mass collective farm movement. What is the new feature of the present collective farm movement? Asked Comrade Stalin in his article, A Year of Great Change. And he answered, the new and decisive feature of the present collective farm movement is that the peasants are joining the collective farms not in separate groups, as was formerly the case, but in whole villages, whole volosts, rural districts, whole districts and even whole areas. And what does that mean? It means that the middle peasant has joined the collective farm movement. And that is the basis of that radical change in the development of agriculture which represents the most important achievement of the Soviet government. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. This meant that the time was becoming ripe, or had already become ripe, for the elimination of the kulaks as a class, on the basis of solid collectivization. BRIEFSUMMARY. During the period 1926 to 29, the party grappled with and overcame immense difficulties on the home and foreign fronts in the fight for the socialist industrialization of the country. The efforts of the party and the working class ended in the victory of the policy of socialist industrialization. In the main, one of the most difficult problems of industrialization had been solved, namely, the problem of accumulating funds for the building of a heavy industry. The foundations were laid of a heavy industry capable of re-equipping the entire national economy. The first 5-year plan of socialist construction was adopted. The building of new factories, state farms and collective farms was developed on a vast scale. This advance towards socialism was attended by a sharpening of the class struggle in the country and a sharpening of the struggle within the party. The chief results of this struggle were that the resistance of the kulaks was crushed, the bloc of Trotskyite and Zinovieite capitulators was exposed as an anti-Soviet bloc, the right capitulators were exposed as agents of the kulaks, the Trotskyites were expelled from the party, and the views of the Trotskyites and the right opportunists were declared incompatible with membership of the CPSU. Defeated ideologically by the Bolshevik Party, and having lost all support among the working class, the Trotskyites ceased to be a political trend and became an unprincipled, careerist clique of political swindlers, a gang of political double-dealers. Having laid the foundations of a heavy industry, the party mustered the working class and the peasantry for the fulfillment of the first 5-year plan for the socialist reconstruction of the USSR. Socialist emulation developed all over the country among millions of working people, giving rise to a mighty wave of labor enthusiasm and originating a new labor discipline. This period ended with a year of great change, signalized by sweeping victories of socialism in industry, the first important successes in agriculture, the swing of the middle peasant towards the collective farms, and the beginning of a mass collective farm movement. CHAPTERELEVEN. The Bolshevik Party in the struggle for the collectivization of agriculture. 1930-1934. 1. International situation in 1930-34. Economic crisis in the capitalist countries. Japanese annexation of Manchuria. Fascists, advent to power in Germany. 2. Seats of war. While in the USSR important progress had been made in the socialist industrialization of the country and industry was rapidly developing, in the capitalist countries a devastating world economic crisis of unprecedented dimensions had broken out at the end of 1929 and grew steadily more acute in the 3 following years. The industrial crisis was interwoven with an agrarian crisis, which made matters still worse for the capitalist countries. In the 3 years of economic crisis, 1930-33, industrial output in the USA had sunk to 65%, in Great Britain to 86%, in Germany to 66% and in France to 77% of the 1929 output. Yet in this same period industrial output in the USSR more than doubled, amounting in 1933 to 201% of the 1929 output. This was but an additional proof of the superiority of the socialist economic system over the capitalist economic system. It showed that the country of socialism is the only country in the world which is exempt from economic crises. The world economic crisis condemned 24 million unemployed to starvation, poverty and misery. The agrarian crisis brought suffering to tens of millions of peasants. The world economic crisis further aggravated the contradictions between the imperialist states, between the victor countries and the vanquished countries, between the imperialist states and the colonial independent countries, between the workers and the capitalists, between the peasants and the landlords. In his report on behalf of the Central Committee to the 16th Party Congress, Comrade Stalin pointed out that the bourgeoisie would seek a way out of the economic crisis, on the one hand, by crushing the 300 working class through the establishment of fascist dictatorship, i.e., the dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, most imperialistic capitalist elements, and, on the other hand, by fomenting war for the redivision of colonies and spheres of influence at the expense of the poorly defended countries. That is just what happened. In 1932, the war danger was aggravated by Japan. Perceiving that, owing to the economic crisis, the European powers and the USA were wholly engrossed in their domestic affairs, the Japanese imperialists decided to seize the opportunity and bring pressure to bear on poorly defended China, in an attempt to subjugate her and to lord it over the country. Unscrupulously exploiting local incidents they themselves had provoked, the Japanese imperialists, like robbers, without declaring war on China, marched their troops into Manchuria. The Japanese soldiery seized the whole of Manchuria, thereby preparing a convenient place d'armes for the conquest of North China and for an attack on the USSR. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in order to leave her hands free, and began to arm at a feverish pace. This impelled the USA, Britain and France to strengthen their naval armaments in the Far East. It was obvious that Japan was out to subjugate China and to eject the European and American imperialist powers from that country. They replied by increasing their armaments. But Japan was pursuing another purpose, too, namely, to seize the Soviet Far East. Naturally, the USSR could not shut its eyes to this danger, and began intensively to strengthen the defenses of its Far Eastern territory. Thus, in the Far East, thanks to the Japanese fascist imperialists, there arose the first seed of war. But it was not only in the Far East that the economic crisis aggravated the contradictions of capitalism. It aggravated them in Europe too. The prolonged crisis in industry and agriculture, the huge volume of unemployment, and the growing insecurity of the poorer classes fanned the discontent of the workers and peasants. The discontent of the working class grew into revolutionary disaffection. This was particularly the case in Germany, which was economically exhausted by the war, by the payment of reparations to the Anglo-French victors, and by the economic crisis, and the working class of which languished under a double yoke, that of the home and the foreign, the British and French bourgeoisie. The extent of this discontent was clearly indicated by the 6 million votes cast for the German Communist Party at the last Reichstag elections, before the fascists came to power. The German bourgeoisie perceived that the bourgeois democratic liberties preserved in Germany might play them an evil trick, that the working class might use these liberties to extend the revolutionary movement. They therefore decided that there was only one way of maintaining the power of the bourgeoisie in Germany, and that was to abolish the bourgeois liberties, to reduce the Reichstag to a cipher, and to establish a terrorist bourgeois nationalist dictatorship, which would be able to suppress the working class and base itself on the petty bourgeois masses who wanted to revenge Germany's defeat in the war. And so they called to power the Fascist Party, which in order to hoodwink the people calls itself the National Socialist Party, well knowing that the Fascist Party, first, represents that section of the imperialist bourgeoisie which is the most reactionary and most hostile to the working class, and, secondly, that it is the most pronounced party of revenge, one capable of beguiling the millions of the nationalistically minded petty bourgeoisie. In this they were assisted by the traitors to the working class, the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, who paved the way for fascism by their policy of compromise. These were the conditions which brought about the accession to power of the German fascists in 1933. Analyzing the events in Germany in his report to the 17th Party Congress, Comrade Stalin said, "The victory of fascism in Germany must be regarded not only as a symptom of the weakness of the working class and a result of the betrayals of the working class by the Social Democratic Party, which paved the way for fascism. It must also be regarded as a symptom of the weakness of the bourgeoisie, of the fact that the bourgeoisie is already unable to rule by the old methods of parliamentarism and bourgeois democracy, and, as a consequence, is compelled in its home policy to resort to terroristic methods of rule." J. Stalin, 17th Congress of the CPSU, Report on the Work of the Central Committee of the CPSU, B, page 17. The German fascists inaugurated their home policy by setting fire to the Reichstag, brutally suppressing the working class, destroying its organizations, and abolishing the bourgeois democratic liberties. They inaugurated their foreign policy by withdrawing from the League of Nations and openly preparing for a war for the forcible revision of the frontiers of the European states to the advantage of Germany. Thus, in the center of Europe, thanks to the German fascists, there arose a second seed of war. Naturally, the USSR could not shut its eyes to so serious a fact, and began to keep a sharp watch on the course of events in the West and to strengthen its defenses on the western frontiers. 2. From the policy of restricting the kulak elements. to the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class. Struggle against distortions of the party policy in the collective farm movement. Offensive against the capitalist elements along the whole line. 16th Party Congress. The mass influx of the peasants into the collective farms in 1929 and 1930 was a result of the whole preceding work of the party and the government. The growth of socialist industry, which had begun the mass production of tractors and machines for agriculture, the vigorous measures taken against the kulaks during the grain purchasing campaigns of 1928 and 1929, the spread of agricultural cooperative societies, which gradually accustomed the peasants to collective farming, the good results obtained by the first collective farms and state farms. All this prepared the way for solid collectivization, when the peasants of entire villages, districts and regions joined the collective farms. Solid collectivization was not just a peaceful process, the overwhelming bulk of the peasantry simply joining the collective farms, but was a struggle of the peasant masses against the kulaks. Solid collectivization meant that all the land in a village area in which a collective farm was formed passed into the hands of the collective farm. But a considerable portion of this land was held by the kulaks, and therefore the peasants would expropriate them, driving them from the land, dispossessing them of their cattle and machinery and demanding their arrest and eviction from the district by the Soviet authorities. Solid collectivization therefore meant the elimination of the kulaks. This was a policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class, on the basis of solid collectivization. By this time, the USSR had a strong enough material base to allow it to put an end to the kulaks, break their resistance, eliminate them as a class and replace kulak farming by collective and state farming. In 1927, the kulaks still produced over 600 million poods of grain, of which about 130 million poods were available for sale. In that year the collective and state farms had only 35 million poods of grain available for sale. In 1929, thanks to the Bolshevik Party's firm policy of developing state farms and collective farms, and likewise to the progress made by socialist industry in supplying the countryside with tractors and agricultural machinery, the collective farms and state farms had become an important factor. In that year the collective farms and state farms already produced no less than 400 million poods of grain, of which over 130 million poods were marketed. This was more than the kulaks had marketed in 1927. And in 1930 the collective farms and state farms were to produce, and actually did produce, over 400 million poods of grain for the market, which was incomparably more than had been marketed by the kulaks in 1927. Thus, thanks to the changed alignment of class forces in the economic life of the country, and the existence of the necessary material base for the replacement of the kulak grain output by that of the collective and state farms, the Bolshevik Party was able to proceed from the policy of restricting the kulaks to a new policy, the policy of eliminating them as a class, on the basis of solid collectivization. Prior to 1929, the Soviet government had pursued a policy of restricting the kulaks. It had imposed higher taxes on the kulak, and had required him to sell grain to the state at fixed prices. By the law on the renting of land it had to a certain extent restricted the amount of land he could use. By the law on the employment of hired labor on private farms it had limited the scope of his farm. But it had not yet pursued a policy of eliminating the kulaks, since the laws on the renting of land and the hiring of labor allowed them to carry on, while the prohibition of their expropriation gave them a certain guarantee in this respect. The effect of this policy was to arrest the growth of the kulak class, some sections of which, unable to withstand the pressure of these restrictions, were forced out of business and ruined. But this policy did not destroy the economic foundations of the kulaks as a class, nor did it tend to eliminate them. It was a policy of restricting the kulaks, not of eliminating them. This policy was essential up to a certain time, that is, as long as the collective farms and state farms were still weak and unable to replace the kulaks in the production of grain. At the end of 1929, with the growth of the collective farms and state farms, the Soviet government turned sharply from this policy to the policy of eliminating the kulaks, of destroying them as a class. It repealed the laws on the renting of land and the hiring of labor, thus, depriving the kulaks both of land and of hired laborers. It lifted the ban on the expropriation of the kulaks. It permitted the peasants to confiscate cattle, machines and other farm property from the kulaks for the benefit of the collective farms. The kulaks were expropriated. Created just as the capitalists had been expropriated in the sphere of industry in 1918, with this difference, however, that the kulaks' means of production did not pass into the hands of the state, but into the hands of the peasants united in the collective farms. This was a profound revolution, a leap from an old qualitative state of society to a new qualitative state, equivalent in its consequences to the revolution of October 1917. The distinguishing feature of this revolution is that it was accomplished from above, on the initiative of the state, and directly supported from below by the millions of peasants, who were fighting to throw off kulak bondage and to live in freedom in the collective farms. This revolution, at one blow, solved three fundamental problems of socialist construction. A. It eliminated the most numerous class of exploiters in our country, the kulak class, the mainstay of capitalist restoration. B. It transferred the most numerous laboring class in our country, the peasant class, from the path of individual farming, which breeds capitalism, to the path of cooperative, collective, socialist farming. C. It furnished the Soviet regime with a socialist base in agriculture, the most extensive and vitally necessary, yet least developed, branch of national economy. This destroyed the last mainsprings of the restoration of capitalism within the country and at the same time created new and decisive conditions for the building up of a socialist economic system. Explaining the reasons for the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class, and summing up the results of the mass movement of the peasants for solid collectivization, Comrade Stalin wrote in 1929. The last hope of the capitalists of all countries, who are dreaming of restoring capitalism in the USSR, the sacred principle of private property, is collapsing and vanishing. The peasants, whom they regarded as material manuring the soil for capitalism, are abandoning en masse the lauded banner of private property, and are taking to the path of collectivism, the path of socialism. The last hope for the restoration of capitalism is crumbling. Stalin, Leninism, Volume 2, A Year of Great Change. The policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class was embodied in the historic resolution on the rate of collectivization and state measures to assist the development of collective farms, adopted by the Central Committee of the CPSU, B, on January 5, 1930. In this decision, full account was taken of the diversity of conditions in the various districts of the USSR and the varying degrees to which the regions were ripe for collectivization. Different rates of collectivization were established, for which purpose the Central Committee of the CPSU, B, divided the regions of the USSR into three groups. The first group included the principal grain-growing areas, viz., the North Caucasus, the Kuban, Don and Terek, the Middle Volga and the Lower Volga, which were ripest for collectivization since they had the most tractors, the most state farms, and the most experience in fighting the kulaks, gained in past grain purchasing campaigns. The Central Committee proposed that in this group of grain-growing areas collectivization should in the main be completed in the spring of 1931. The second group of grain-growing areas, the Ukraine, the Central Black Earth region, Siberia, the Urals, Kazakhstan and others could complete collectivization in the main in the spring of 1932. The other regions, territories and republics, Moscow region, Transcaucasia, the republics of Central Asia, etc., could extend the process of collectivization to the end of the five-year plan, that is, to 1933. In view of the growing speed of collectivization, the Central Committee of the party considered it necessary to accelerate the construction of plants for the production of tractors, harvester combines, tractor-drawn machinery, etc. Simultaneously, the Central Committee demanded that the tendency to underestimate the importance of horse traction at the present stage of the collective farm movement, a tendency which was leading to the reckless disposal and sale of horses, be resolutely checked. State loans to collective farms for the year 1929-30 were doubled, 500 million rubles, as compared with the original plan. The expense of the surveying and demarcation of the lands of the collective farms was to be borne by the state. The resolution contained the highly important direction that the chief form of the collective farm movement at the given stage must be the agricultural artel, in which only the principal means of production are collectivized. The Central Committee most seriously warned party organizations against any attempts whatsoever to force the collective farm movement by decrees from above, which might involve the danger of the substitution of mock collectivization for real socialist emulation in the organization of collective farms. Resolutions of the CPSU, B. Russ. ed. Part 2, page 662. In this resolution the Central Committee made it clear how the party's new policy in the countryside should be applied. The policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class and of solid collectivization stimulated a powerful collective farm movement. The peasants of whole villages and districts joined the collective farms, sweeping the kulaks from their path and freeing themselves from kulak bondage. But with all the phenomenal progress of collectivization, certain faults on the part of party workers, distortions of the party policy in collective farm development, soon revealed themselves. Although the Central Committee had warned party workers not to be carried away by the success of collectivization, many of them began to force the pace of collectivization artificially, without regard to the conditions of time and place, and heedless of the degree of readiness of the peasants to join the collective farms. It was found that the voluntary principle of forming collective farms was being violated, and that in a number of districts the peasants were being forced into the collective farms under threat of being dispossessed, disfranchised, and so on. In a number of districts, preparatory work and patient explanation of the underlying principles of the party's policy with regard to collectivization were being replaced by bureaucratic decreeing from above, by exaggerated, fictitious figures regarding the formation of collective farms, by an artificial inflation of the percentage of collectivization. Although the Central Committee had specified that the chief form of the collective farm movement must be the agricultural artel, in which only the principal means of production are collectivized, in a number of places big-headed attempts were made to skip the artel form and pass straight to the commune. dwellings, milch cows, small livestock, poultry, etc., not exploited for the market, were collectivized. Carried away by the initial success of collectivization, persons in authority in certain regions violated the Central Committee's explicit instructions regarding the pace and time limits of collectivization. In their zeal for inflated figures, the leadership of the Moscow region gave the cue to their subordinates to complete collectivization by the spring of 1930, although they had no less than 3 years, till the end of 1932, for this purpose. Even grosser were the violations in Transcaucasia and Central Asia. Taking advantage of these distortions of policy for their own provocative ends, the kulaks and their toadies would themselves propose that communes be formed instead of agricultural artels, and that dwellings, small livestock and poultry be collectivized forthwith. Furthermore, the kulaks instigated the peasants to slaughter their animals before entering the collective farms, arguing that they will be taken away anyhow. The class enemy calculated that the distortions and mistakes committed by the local organizations in the process of collectivization would incense the peasantry and provoke revolts against the Soviet government. As a result of the mistakes of party organizations and the downright provocateur actions of the class enemy, in the latter half of February 1930, against the general background of the unquestionable success of collectivization, there were dangerous signs of serious discontent among the peasantry in a number of districts. Here and there, the kulaks and their agents even succeeded in inciting the peasants to outright anti-Soviet actions. Having received a number of alarming signals of distortions of the party line that might jeopardize collectivization, the Central Committee of the party immediately proceeded to remedy the situation, to set the party workers the task of rectifying the mistakes as quickly as possible. On March 2, 1930, by decision of the Central Committee, Comrade Stalin's article, Dizzy with Success, was published. This article was a warning to all who had been so carried away by the success of collectivization as to commit gross mistakes and depart from the party line, to all who were trying to coerce the peasants to join the collective farms. The article laid the utmost emphasis on the principle that the formation of collective farms must be voluntary, and on the necessity of making allowances for the diversity of conditions in the various districts of the USSR when determining the pace and methods of collectivization. Comrade Stalin reiterated that the chief form of the collective farm movement was the agricultural artel, in which only the principal means of production, chiefly those used in grain growing, are collectivized, while household land, dwellings, part of the dairy cattle, small livestock, poultry, etc., are not collectivized. Comrade Stalin's article was of the utmost political moment. It helped the party organizations to rectify their mistakes and dealt a severe blow to the enemies of the Soviet government who had been hoping to take advantage of the distortions of policy to set the peasants against the Soviet government. The broad mass of the peasants now saw that the line of the Bolshevik Party had nothing in common with the pig-headed, left, distortions of local authorities. The article set the minds of the peasants at rest. In order to complete the work begun by Comrade Stalin's article in rectifying distortions and mistakes, the Central Committee of the CPSU-B decided to strike another blow at them, and on March 15, 1930, published its resolution on measures to combat the distortions of the party line in the collective farm movement. This resolution made a detailed analysis of the mistakes committed, showing that they were the result of a departure from the Leninist-Stalinist line of the party, the result of a flagrant breach of party instructions. The Central Committee pointed out that these left distortions were of direct service to the class enemy. The Central Committee gave directions that persons who are unable or unwilling earnestly to combat distortions of the party line must be removed from their posts and replaced. Resolutions of the CPSU-B, Part 2, page 663. The Central Committee changed the leadership of certain regional and territorial party organizations, Moscow Region, Transcaucasia, which had committed political mistakes and proved incapable of rectifying them. On April 3, 1930, Comrade Stalin's reply to Collective Farm Comrades was published, in which he indicated the root cause of the mistakes in the peasant question and the major mistakes committed in the collective farm movement, viz. An incorrect approach to the middle peasant, violation of the Leninist principle that the formation of collective farms must be voluntary, violation of the Leninist principle that allowance must be made for the diversity of conditions in the various districts of the USSR, and the attempts to skip the artel form and to pass straight to the commune. The result of all these measures was that the party secured the correction of the distortions of policy committed by local party workers in a number of districts. It required the utmost firmness on the part of the Central Committee in its ability to go against the current in order to promptly correct that considerable body of party workers who, carried away by success, had been rapidly straying from the party line. The party succeeded in correcting the distortions of the party line in the collective farm movement. This made it possible to consolidate the success of the collective farm movement. It also made possible a new and powerful advance of the collective farm movement. Prior to the party's adoption of the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class, an energetic offensive against the capitalist elements with the object of eliminating them had been waged chiefly in the towns, on the industrial front. So far, the countryside, agriculture, had been lagging behind the towns, behind industry. Consequently, the offensive had not borne an all-round, complete and general character. But now that the backwardness of the countryside was becoming a thing of the past, now that the peasants' fight for the elimination of the kulak class had taken clear shape, and the party had adopted the policy of eliminating the kulak class, the offensive against the capitalist elements assumed a general character. The partial offensive developed into an offensive along the whole front. By the time the 16th Party Congress was convened, the general offensive against the capitalist elements was proceeding all along the line. The 16th Party Congress met on June 26, 1930. It was attended by 1,268 delegates with vote and 891 delegates with voice but no vote, representing 1,260,874 party members and 711,609 candidate members. The 16th Party Congress is known in the annals of the party as the Congress of the Sweeping Offensive of Socialism along the whole front, of the elimination of the kulaks as a class, and of the realization of solid collectivization. Stalin. Presenting the political report of the Central Committee, Comrade Stalin showed what big victories had been won by the Bolshevik Party in developing the socialist offensive. Socialist industrialization had progressed so far that the share of industry in the total production of the country now predominated over that of agriculture. In the fiscal year 1929-30, the share of industry already comprised no less than 53% of the total production of the country, while the share of agriculture was about 47%. In the fiscal year 1926-27, at the time of the 15th Party Congress, the total output of industry had been only 102.5% of the pre-war output. In the year 1929-30, at the time of the 16th Congress, it was already about 180%. Heavy industry, the production of means of production, machine building, was steadily growing in power. "We are on the eve of the transformation of our country from an agrarian to an industrial country," declared Comrade Stalin at the Congress, amidst hearty acclamation. Still, the high rate of industrial development, Comrade Stalin explained, was not to be confused with the level of industrial development. Despite the unprecedented rate of development of socialist industry, we were still far behind the advanced capitalist countries as regards the level of industrial development. This was so in the case of electric power, in spite of the phenomenal progress of electrification in the USSR. This was the case with metal. According to the plan, the output of pig iron in the USSR was to be 5,500,000 tons in the year 1929-30, when the output of pig iron in Germany in 1929 was 13,400,000 tons, and in France 10,450,000 tons. In order to make good our technical and economic backwardness in the minimum of time, our rate of industrial development had to be further accelerated, and a most resolute fight waged against the opportunists who were striving to reduce the rate of development of socialist industry. People who talk about the necessity of reducing the rate of development of our industry are enemies of socialism, agents of our class enemies, said Comrade Stalin. Stalin, Leninism, Volume 2, Political Report of the Central Committee to the 16th Congress of the CPSU. After the program of the first year of the first five-year plan had been successfully fulfilled and surpassed, a slogan originated among the masses: "Fulfill the five-year plan in 4 years." A number of branches of industry, oil, peat, general machine building, agricultural machinery, electrical equipment, were carrying out their plans so successfully that their five-year plans could be fulfilled in 2.5 or 3 years. This proved that the slogan, "The five-year plan in 4 years," was quite feasible, and thus exposed the opportunism of the skeptics who doubted it. The 16th Congress instructed the Central Committee of the party to ensure that the spirited Bolshevik tempo of socialist construction be maintained, and that the five-year plan be actually fulfilled in 4 years. By the time of the 16th Party Congress, a momentous change had taken place in the development of agriculture in the USSR. The broad masses of the peasantry had turned towards socialism. On May 1, 1930, collectivization in the principal grain-growing regions embraced 40 to 50% of the peasant households, as against 2 to 3% in the spring of 1928. The crop area of the collective farms reached 36 million hectares. Thus, the increased program, 30 million hectares, laid down in the resolution of the Central Committee of January 5, 1930, was more than fulfilled. The five-year program of collective farm development had been fulfilled more than 1.5 times in the space of 2 years. In 3 years, the amount of produce marketed by the collective farms had increased more than 40-fold. Already in 1930 more than from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, half the marketed grain in the country came from the collective farms, quite apart from the grain produced by the state farms. This meant that from now on the fortunes of agriculture would be decided not by the individual peasant farms, but by the collective and state farms. While, before the mass influx of the peasantry into the collective farms, the Soviet power had leaned mainly on socialist industry, Now it began to lean also on the rapidly expanding socialist sector of agriculture, the collective and state farms. The collective farm peasantry, as the 16th Party Congress stated in one of its resolutions, had become a real and firm mainstay of the Soviet power. 3. Policy of reconstructing all branches of the national economy. Importance of technique. Further, spread of the collective farm movement. Political departments of the machine and tractor stations. Results of the fulfillment of the 5-year plan in 4 years. Victory of socialism along the whole front. 17th Party Congress. When heavy industry and especially the machine-building industry had been built up and placed securely on their feet, and it was moreover clear that they were developing at a fairly rapid pace, the next task that faced the party was to reconstruct all branches of the national economy on modern, up-to-date lines. Modern technique, modern machinery had to be supplied to the fuel industry, the metallurgical industry, the light industries, the food industry, the timber industry, the armament industry, the transport system, and to agriculture. In view of the colossal increase in the demand for farm produce and manufactured goods, it was necessary to double and treble output in all branches of production. But this could not be done unless the factories and mills, the state farms and collective farms were adequately supplied with up-to-date equipment, since the requisite increase of output could not be secured with the old equipment. Unless the major branches of the national economy were reconstructed, it would be impossible to satisfy the new and ever-growing demands of the country and its economic system. Without reconstruction, it would be impossible to complete the offensive of socialism along the whole front, for the capitalist elements in town and country had to be fought and vanquished not only by a new organization of labor and property, but also by a new technique, by technical superiority. Without reconstruction, it would be impossible to overtake and outstrip the technically and economically advanced capitalist countries, for although the USSR had surpassed the capitalist countries in rate of industrial development, it still lagged a long way behind them in level of industrial development, in quantity of industrial output. In order that we might catch up with them, every branch of production had to be equipped with new technique and reconstructed on the most up-to-date technical lines. The question of technique had thus become of decisive importance. The main impediment was not so much an insufficiency of modern machinery and machine tools, for our machine-building industry was in a position to produce modern equipment, as the wrong attitude of our business executives to technique, their tendency to underrate the importance of technique in the period of reconstruction and to disdain it. In their opinion, technical matters were the affair of the experts, something of second-rate importance, to be left in charge of the bourgeois experts. They considered that communist business executives need not interfere in the technical side of production and should attend to something more important, namely, the general management of industry. The bourgeois experts were therefore given a free hand in matters of production, while the communist business executives reserved to themselves the function of general direction, the signing of papers. It need scarcely be said that with such an attitude, general direction was bound to degenerate into a mere parody of direction, a sterile signing of papers, a futile fussing with papers. It is clear that if communist business executives had persisted in this disdainful attitude of technical matters, we would never have been able to overtake the advanced capitalist countries, let alone outstrip them. This attitude, especially in the Reconstruction period, would have doomed our country to backwardness, and would have lowered our rates of development. As a matter of fact, this attitude to technical matters was a screen, a mask for the secret wish of a certain section of the communist business executives to reduce the rate of industrial development, so as to be able to take it easy, by shunting the responsibility for production onto the experts. It was necessary to get communist business executives to turn their attention to technical matters, to acquire a taste for technique. They needed to be shown that it was vital for Bolshevik business executives to master modern technique, otherwise we would run the risk of condemning our country to backwardness and stagnation. Unless this problem were solved, further progress would be impossible. Of utmost importance in this connection was the speech Comrade Stalin made at the first conference of industrial managers in February 1931. It is sometimes asked, said Comrade Stalin, whether it is not possible to slow down the tempo a bit, to put a check on the movement. No, comrades, it is not possible. The tempo must not be reduced. To slacken the tempo would mean falling behind. And those who fall behind get beaten. But we do not want to be beaten. No, we refuse to be beaten. Incidentally, the history of old Russia is one unbroken record of the beatings she suffered for falling behind, for her backwardness. She was beaten by the Mongol Khans. She was beaten by the Turkish Beys. She was beaten by the Swedish feudal lords. She was beaten by the Polish and Lithuanian gentry. She was beaten by the British and French capitalists. She was beaten by the Japanese barons. All beat her, for her backwardness. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us. In 10 years at most we must make good the distance we are lagging behind the advanced capitalist countries. We have all the objective opportunities for this. The only thing lacking is the ability to make proper use of these opportunities. And that depends on us. Only on us. It is time we learn to use these opportunities. It is time to put an end to the rotten policy of non-interference in production. It is time to adopt a new policy, a policy adapted to the times, the policy of interfering in everything. If you are a factory manager, then interfere in all the affairs of the factory, look into everything, let nothing escape you, learn and learn again. Bolsheviks must master technique. It is time Bolsheviks themselves became experts. In the period of Reconstruction, technique decides everything. Stalin, Leninism, Volume 2. The tasks of business managers. The historic importance of Comrade Stalin's speech lay in the fact that it put an end to the disdainful attitude of communist business executives to technique, made them face the question of technique, opened a new phase in the struggle for the mastery of technique by the Bolsheviks themselves, and thereby helped to promote the work of economic reconstruction. From then on, technical knowledge ceased to be a monopoly of the bourgeois experts, and became a matter of vital concern to the Bolshevik business executives themselves, while the word expert ceased to be a term of disparagement and became the honorable title of Bolsheviks who had mastered technique. From then on there were bound to appear, and there actually did appear, thousands upon thousands, whole battalions of red experts, who had mastered technique and were able to direct industries. This was a new, Soviet technical intelligentsia, an intelligentsia of the working class and the peasantry, and they now constitute the main force in the management of our industries. All this was bound to promote, and actually did promote, the work of economic reconstruction. Reconstruction was not confined to industry and transport. It developed even more rapidly in agriculture. The reason is not far to seek. Agriculture was less mechanized than other branches, and here the need for modern machinery was felt more acutely than elsewhere. And it was urgently essential to increase the supply of modern agricultural machines now that the number of collective farms was growing from month to month and week to week, and with it the demand for thousands upon thousands of tractors and other agricultural machines. The year 1931 witnessed a further advance in the collective farm movement. In the principal grain-growing districts, over 80% of the peasant farms had already amalgamated to form collective farms. Here, solid collectivization had in the main already been achieved. In the less important grain-growing districts and in the districts growing industrial crops, about 50% of the peasant farms had joined the collective farms. By now there were 500,000 collective farms and 4,000 state farms, which together cultivated 2/3 of the total crop area of the country, the individual peasants cultivating only 1/3. This was a tremendous victory for socialism in the countryside. But the progress of the collective farm movement was so far to be measured in breadth rather than in depth. The collective farms were increasing in number and were spreading to district after district, but there was no commensurate improvement in the work of the collective farms or in the skill of their personnel. This was due to the fact that the growth of the leading cadres and trained personnel of the collective farms was not keeping pace with the numerical growth of the collective farms themselves. The consequence was that the work of the new collective farms was not always satisfactory, and the collective farms themselves were still weak. They were also held back by the shortage in the countryside of literate people indispensable to the collective farms, bookkeepers, stores managers, secretaries, etc., and by the inexperience of the peasants in the management of large-scale collective enterprises. The collective farmers were the individual peasants of yesterday. They had experience in farming small plots of land, but none in managing big, collective farms. This experience could not be acquired in a day. The first stages of collective farm work were consequently marred by serious defects. It was found that work was still badly organized in the collective farms. Labor discipline was slack. In many collective farms the income was distributed not by the number of workday units, but by the number of mouths to feed in the family. It often happened that slackers got a bigger return than conscientious hard-working collective farmers. These defects in the management of collective farms lowered the incentive of their members. There were many cases of members absenting themselves from work even at the height of the season, leaving part of the crops unharvested until the winter snows, while the reaping was done so carelessly that large quantities of grain were lost. The absence of individual responsibility for machines and horses, and for work generally, weakened the collective farms and reduced their revenues. The situation was particularly bad wherever former kulaks and their toadies had managed to worm their way into collective farms and to secure positions of trust in them. Not infrequently former kulaks would betake themselves to districts where they were unknown, and there make their way into the collective farms with the deliberate intention of sabotaging and doing mischief. Sometimes, owing to lack of vigilance on the part of party workers and Soviet officials, kulaks managed to get into collective farms even in their own districts. What made it easier for former kulaks to penetrate into the collective farms was that they had radically changed their tactics. Formerly the kulaks had fought the collective farms openly, had savagely persecuted collective farm leading cadres and foremost collective farmers, nefariously murdering them, burning down their houses and barns. By these methods they had thought to intimidate the peasantry and to deter them from joining the collective farms. Now that their open struggle against the collective farms had failed, they changed their tactics. They laid aside their sawn-off shotguns and posed as innocent, unoffending folk who would not hurt a fly. They pretended to be loyal Soviet supporters. Once inside the collective farms, they stealthily carried on their sabotage. They strove to disorganize the collective farms from within, to undermine labor discipline and to muddle the harvest accounts and the records of work performed. It was part of their sinister scheme to destroy the horses of the collective farms by deliberately infecting them with glanders, mange and other diseases, or disabling them by neglect or other methods, in which they were often successful. They did damage to tractors and farm machinery. The kulaks were often able to deceive the collective farmers and commit sabotage with impunity because the collective farms were still weak and their personnel still inexperienced. To put an end to the sabotage of the kulaks and to expedite the work of strengthening the collective farms, the latter had to be given urgent and effective assistance in men, advice and leadership. This assistance was forthcoming from the Bolshevik Party. In January 1933, the Central Committee of the party adopted a decision to organize political departments in the machine and tractor stations serving the collective farms. Some 17,000 party members were sent into the countryside to work in these political departments and to aid the collective farms. This assistance was highly effective. In 2 years, 1933 and 1934, the political departments of the machine and tractor stations did a great deal to build up an active body of collective farmers, to eliminate the defects in the work of the collective farms, to consolidate them, and to rid them of kulak enemies and wreckers. The political departments performed their task with credit. They strengthened the collective farms both in regard to organization and efficiency, trained skilled personnel for them, improved their management and raised the political level of the collective farm members. Of great importance in stimulating the collective farmers to strive for the strengthening of the collective farms was the First All-Union Congress of Collective Farm Shock Workers, February 1933, and the speech made by Comrade Stalin at this Congress. Contrasting the old, pre-collective farm system in the countryside with the new, collective farm system, Comrade Stalin said, "Under the old system the peasants each worked in isolation, following the ancient methods of their forefathers and using antiquated implements of labor. They worked for the landlords and capitalists, the kulaks and profiteers. They lived in penury while they enriched others. Under the new, collective farm system, the peasants work in common, cooperatively, with the help of modern implements, tractors and agricultural machinery. They work for themselves and their collective farms. They live without capitalists and landlords, without kulaks and profiteers. They work with the object of raising their standard of welfare and culture from day to day." Stalin, Problems of Leninism, Rus. ed. Page 528. Comrade Stalin showed in this speech what the peasants had achieved by adopting the collective farm way. The Bolshevik Party had helped millions of poor peasants to join the collective farms and to escape from servitude to the kulaks. By joining the collective farms, and having the best lands and the finest instruments of production at their disposal, millions of poor peasants who had formerly lived in penury had now as collective farmers risen to the level of middle peasants, and had attained material security. This was the first step in the development of collective farms, the first achievement. The next step, Comrade Stalin said, was to raise the collective farmers, both former poor peasants and former middle peasants, to an even higher level, to make all the collective farmers prosperous and all the collective farms Bolshevik. Only one thing is now needed for the collective farmers to become prosperous, Comrade Stalin said, and that is for them to work in the collective farms conscientiously, to make efficient use of the tractors and machines, to make efficient use of the draft cattle, to cultivate the land efficiently, and to cherish collective farm property. Ibid. pp. 532-3. Comrade Stalin's speech made a profound impression on the millions of collective farmers and became a practical program of action for the collective farms. By the end of 1934, the collective farms had become a strong and invincible force. They already embraced about 3/4 of all the peasant households in the Soviet Union and about 90% of the total crop area. In 1934, there were already 281,000 tractors and 32,000 harvester combines at work in the Soviet countryside. The spring sowing in that year was completed 15 to 20 days earlier than in 1933, and 30 to 40 days earlier than in 1932, while the plan of grain deliveries to the state was fulfilled 3 months earlier than in 1932. This showed how firmly established the collective farms had become. In 2 years, thanks to the tremendous assistance given them by the party and the workers and peasants state. This solid victory of the collective farm system and the attendant improvement of agriculture enabled the Soviet government to abolish the rationing of bread and all other products and to introduce the unrestricted sale of foodstuffs. Since the political departments of the machine and tractor stations had served the purpose for which they had been temporarily created, the Central Committee decided to convert them into ordinary party bodies by merging them with the district party committees in their localities. All these achievements, both in agriculture and in industry, were made possible by the successful fulfillment of the 5-year plan. By the beginning of 1933, it was evident that the first 5-year Plan had already been fulfilled ahead of time, fulfilled in 4 years and 3 months. This was a tremendous, epoch-making victory of the working class and peasantry of the USSR. Reporting to a plenary meeting of the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission of the party, held in January 1933, Comrade Stalin reviewed the results of the first 5-year plan. The report made it clear that in the period which it took to fulfill the first 5-year plan, the party and the Soviet government had achieved the following major results. A. The USSR had been converted from an agrarian country into an industrial country, for the proportion of industrial output to the total production of the country had risen to 70%. B. The socialist economic system had eliminated the capitalist elements in the sphere of industry and had become the sole economic system in industry. C. The socialist economic system had eliminated the kulaks as a class in the sphere of agriculture, and had become the predominant force in agriculture. D. The collective farm system had put an end to poverty and want in the countryside, and tens of millions of poor peasants had risen to a level of material security. E. The socialist system in industry had abolished unemployment, and while retaining the 8-hour day in a number of branches, had introduced the 7-hour day in the vast majority of enterprises and the 6-hour day in unhealthy occupations. F. The victory of socialism in all branches of the national economy had abolished the exploitation of man by man. The sum and substance of the achievements of the first 5-year plan was that they had completely emancipated the workers and peasants from exploitation and had opened the way to a prosperous and cultured life for all working people in the USSR. In January 1934, the party held its 17th Congress. It was attended by 1,225 delegates with vote and 736 delegates with voice but no vote, representing 1,874,488 party members and 935,298 candidate members. The Congress reviewed the work of the party since the last Congress. It noted the decisive results achieved by socialism in all branches of economic and cultural life and placed on record that the general line of the party had triumphed along the whole front. The 17th Party Congress is known in history as the Congress of Victors. Reporting on the work of the Central Committee, Comrade Stalin pointed to the fundamental changes that had taken place in the USSR during the period under review. During this period, the USSR has become radically transformed and has cast off the integument of backwardness and medievalism. From an agrarian country, it has become an industrial country. From a country of small individual agriculture, it has become a country of collective, large-scale mechanized agriculture. From an ignorant, illiterate and uncultured country, it has become, or rather it is becoming, a literate and cultured country covered by a vast network of higher, intermediate and elementary schools teaching in the languages of the nationalities of the USSR. Stalin, 17th Congress of the CPSU, report on the work of the Central Committee of the CPSU, B, page 30. By this time 99% of the industry of the country was socialist industry. Socialist agriculture, the collective farms and state farms, embraced about 90% of the total crop area of the country. As to trade, the capitalist elements had been completely ousted from this domain. When the new economic policy was being introduced, Lenin said that there were the elements of 5 social economic formations in our country. The first was patriarchal economy, which was largely a natural form of economy, i.e., which practically carried on no trade. The second formation was small commodity production, as represented by the majority of the peasant farms, those which sold agricultural produce, and by the artisans. In the first years of NEP, this economic formation embraced the majority of the population. The third formation was private capitalism, which had begun to revive in the early period of NEP. The fourth formation was state capitalism, chiefly in the form of concessions, which had not developed to any considerable extent. The fifth formation was socialism. Socialist industry, which was still weak, state farms and collective farms, which were economically insignificant at the beginning of NEP, state trade and cooperative societies, which were also weak at that time. Of all these formations, Lenin said, the socialist formation must gain the upper hand. The new economic policy was designed to bring about the complete victory of socialist forms of economy. And by the time of the 17th Party Congress, this aim had already been achieved. We can now say, said Comrade Stalin, that the first, the third and the fourth social economic formations no longer exist. The second social economic formation has been forced into a secondary position, while the fifth social economic formation, the socialist formation, now holds unchallenged sway and is the sole commanding force in the whole national economy. Ibid. Page 33. An important place in Comrade Stalin's report was given to the question of ideological political leadership. He warned the party that although its enemies, the opportunists and nationalist deviators of all shades and complexions, had been defeated, remnants of their ideology still lingered in the minds of some party members and often asserted themselves. The survivals of capitalism in economic life and particularly in the minds of men provided a favorable soil for the revival of the ideology of the defeated anti-Leninist groups. The development of people's mentality does not keep pace with their economic position. As a consequence, survivals of bourgeois ideas still remained in men's minds and would continue to do so even though capitalism had been abolished in economic life. It should also be borne in mind that the surrounding capitalist world, against which we had to keep our powder dry, was working to revive and foster these survivals. Comrade Stalin also dwelt on the survivals of capitalism in men's minds on the national question, where they were particularly tenacious. The Bolshevik Party was fighting on two fronts, both against the deviation to Great Russian chauvinism and against the deviation to local nationalism. In a number of republics, the Ukraine, Byelorussia, and others, the party organizations had relaxed the struggle against local nationalism, and had allowed it to grow to such an extent that it had allied itself with hostile forces, the forces of intervention, and had become a danger to the state. In reply to the question, which deviation in the national question was the major danger, Comrade Stalin said, "The major danger is the deviation against which we have ceased to fight, thereby allowing it to grow into a danger to the state." Ibid. Page 81. Comrade Stalin called upon the party to be more active in ideological political work, systematically to expose the ideology and the remnants of the ideology of the hostile classes and of the trends hostile to Leninism. He further pointed out in his report that the adoption of correct decisions does not in itself guarantee the success of a measure. In order to guarantee success, it was necessary to put the right people in the right place, people able to give effect to the decisions of the leading organs and to keep a check on the fulfillment of decisions. Without these organizational measures, there was a risk of decisions remaining scraps of paper, divorced from practical life. Comrade Stalin referred in support of this to Lenin's famous maximum that the chief thing in organizational work was the choice of personnel and the keeping of a check on the fulfillment of decisions. Comrade Stalin said that the disparity between adopted decisions and the organizational work of putting these decisions into effect and of keeping a check on their fulfillment was the chief evil in our practical work. In order to keep a better check on the fulfillment of party and government decisions, the 17th Party Congress set up a Party Control Commission under the Central Committee of the CPSU-B, and a Soviet Control Commission under the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR in place of the combined Central Control Commission and Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, this body having completed the tasks for which it had been set up by the 12th Party Congress. Comrade Stalin formulated the organizational tasks of the party in the new stage as follows. 1. Our organizational work must be adapted to the requirements of the political line of the party. 2. Organizational leadership must be raised to the level of political leadership. 3. Organizational leadership must be made fully equal to the task of ensuring the realization of the political slogans and decisions of the party. In conclusion, Comrade Stalin warned the party that although socialism had achieved great successes, successes of which we could be justly proud, we must not allow ourselves to be carried away, to get swelled head, to be lulled by success. We must not lull the party, but sharpen its vigilance. We must not lull it to sleep, but keep it ready for action, not disarm it, but arm it, not demobilize it, but hold it in a state of mobilization for the fulfillment of the second five-year plan, said Comrade Stalin. Ibid. Page 96. The 17th Congress heard reports from Comrades Molotov and Kuibyshev on the second five-year plan for the development of the national economy. The program of the second five-year plan was even vaster than that of the first five-year plan. By the end of the second five-year plan period, in 1937, industrial output was to be increased approximately eightfold in comparison with pre-war. Capital development investments in all branches in the period of the second five-year plan were to amount to 133 billion rubles, as against a little over 64 billion rubles in the period of the first five-year plan. This immense scope of new capital construction work would ensure the complete technical re-equipment of all branches of the national economy. The second five-year plan was to complete in the main the mechanization of agriculture. Aggregate tractor power was to increase from 2,250,000 horsepower in 1932 to over 8 million horsepower in 1937. The plan provided for the extensive employment of scientific agricultural methods, correct crop rotation, use of selected seed, autumn plowing, etc. A tremendous plan for the technical reconstruction of the means of transport and communication was outlined. The second five-year plan contained an extensive program for the further improvement of the material and cultural standards of the workers and peasants. The 17th Congress paid great attention to matters of organization and adopted decisions on the work of the party and the Soviets in connection with a report made by Comrade Kaganovich. The question of organization had acquired even greater importance now that the general line of the party had won and the party policy had been tried and tested by the experience of millions of workers and peasants. The new and complex tasks of the second five-year plan called for a higher standard of work in all spheres. The major tasks of the second five-year plan, viz., to completely eliminate the capitalist elements, to overcome the survivals of capitalism in economic life and in the minds of men, to complete the reconstruction of the whole national economy on modern technical lines, to learn to use the new technical equipment and the new enterprises, to mechanize agriculture and increase its productivity, insistently and urgently confront us with the problem of improving work in all spheres. First and foremost in practical organizational leadership, it was stated in the decisions of the Congress on organizational questions. Resolutions of the CPSU, B. Russ, ed. Part 2, page 591. The 17th Congress adopted new party rules, which differ from the old ones firstly by the addition of a preamble. This preamble gives a brief definition of the Communist Party, and a definition of its role in the struggle of the proletariat and its place in the organism of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The new rules enumerate in detail the duties of party members. Stricter regulations governing the admission of new members and a clause concerning sympathizers groups were introduced. The new rules give a more detailed exposition of the organizational structure of the party, and formulate anew the clauses dealing with the party nuclei, or primary organizations, as they have been called since the 17th Party Congress. The clauses dealing with inter-party democracy and party discipline were also formulated anew. 4. Degeneration of the BUKHARINITES into political double dealers. Degeneration of the TROTSKYITE double dealers into a WHITEGUARD gang of assassins and spies. Foul murder of SM Kirov. Measures of the party to heighten Bolshevik vigilance. The achievements of socialism in our country were a cause of rejoicing not only to the party, and not only to the workers and collective farmers, but also to our Soviet intelligentsia, and to all honest citizens of the Soviet Union. But they were no cause of rejoicing to the remnants of the defeated exploiting classes. On the contrary, they only enraged them the more as time went on. They infuriated the lickspittles of the defeated classes, the puny remnants of the following of Bukharin and Trotsky. These gentry were guided in their evaluation of the achievements. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution of the workers and collective farmers, not by the interests of the people, who applauded every such achievement, but by the interests of their own wretched and putrid faction, which had lost all contact with the realities of life. Since the achievements of socialism in our country meant the victory of the policy of the party and the utter bankruptcy of their own policy, these gentry, instead of admitting the obvious facts and joining the common cause, began to revenge themselves on the party and the people for their own failure, for their own bankruptcy. They began to resort to foul play and sabotage against the cause of the workers and collective farmers, to blow up pits, set fire to factories, and commit acts of wrecking in collective and state farms, with the object of undoing the achievements of the workers and collective farmers and evoking popular discontent against the Soviet government. And in order, while doing so, to shield their puny group from exposure and destruction, they simulated loyalty to the party, fawned upon it, eulogized it, cringed before it more and more, while in reality continuing their underhand, subversive activities against the workers and peasants. At the 17th Party Congress, Bukharin, Rykov and Tomsky made repentant speeches, praising the party and extolling its achievements to the skies. But the Congress detected a ring of insincerity and duplicity in their speeches, for what the party expects from its members is not eulogies and rhapsodies over its achievements, but conscientious work on the socialist front. And this was what the Bukharinites had showed no signs of for a long time. The party saw that the hollow speeches of these gentry were in reality meant for their supporters outside the Congress, to serve as a lesson to them in duplicity, and a call to them not to lay down their arms. Speeches were also made at the 17th Congress by the Trotskyites Zinoviev and Kamenev, who lashed themselves extravagantly for their mistakes, and eulogized the party no less extravagantly for its achievements. But the Congress could not help seeing that both their nauseating self-castigation and their fulsome praise of the party were only meant to hide an uneasy and unclean conscience. However, the party did not yet know or suspect that while these gentry were making their cloying speeches at the Congress, they were hatching a villainous plot against the life of S.M. Kirov. On December 1, 1934, S.M. Kirov was foully murdered in the Smolny, in Leningrad, by a shot from a revolver. The assassin was caught red-handed and turned out to be a member of a secret counter-revolutionary group made up of members of an anti-Soviet group of Zinovievites in Leningrad. S.M. Kirov was loved by the party and the working class, and his murder stirred the people profoundly, sending a wave of wrath and deep sorrow through the country. The investigation established that in 1933 and 1934 an underground counter-revolutionary terrorist group had been formed in Leningrad consisting of former members of the Zinoviev opposition and headed by a so-called Leningrad Center. The purpose of this group was to murder leaders of the Communist Party. S.M. Kirov was chosen as the first victim. The testimony of the members of this counter-revolutionary group showed that they were connected with representatives of foreign capitalist states and were receiving funds from them. The exposed members of this organization were sentenced by the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR to the supreme penalty, to be shot. Soon afterwards the existence of an underground counter-revolutionary organization called the Moscow Center was discovered. The preliminary investigation and the trial revealed the villainous part played by Zinoviev, Kamenev, Yevdokimov and other leaders of this organization in cultivating the terrorist mentality among their followers, and in plotting the murder of members of the party's Central Committee and of the Soviet government. To such depths of duplicity and villainy had these people sunk that Zinoviev, who was one of the organizers and instigators of the assassination of S.M. Kirov, and who had urged the murderer to hasten the crime, wrote an obituary of Kirov speaking of him in terms of eulogy, and demanded that it be published. The Zinovievites simulated remorse in court, but they persisted in their duplicity even in the dock. They concealed their connection with Trotsky. They concealed the fact that together with the Trotskyites they had sold themselves to fascist espionage services. They concealed their spying and wrecking activities. They concealed from the court their connections with the Bukharinites and the existence of a united Trotsky-Bukharin gang of fascist hirelings. As it later transpired, the murder of Comrade Kirov was the work of this united Trotsky-Bukharin gang. Even then, in 1935, it had become clear that the Zinoviev group was a camouflaged White Guard organization whose members fully deserved to be treated as White Guards. A year later it became known that the actual, real and direct organizers of the murder of Kirov were Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev and their accomplices, and that they had also made preparations for the assassination of other members of the Central Committee. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bakayev, Yevdokimov, Pikal, I.N. Smirnov, Marachkovsky, Ter Vaganyan, Reingold and others were committed for trial. Confronted by direct evidence, they had to admit publicly, in open court, that they had not only organized the assassination of Kirov, but had been planning to murder all the other leaders of the party and the government. Later investigation established the fact that these villains had been engaged in espionage and in organizing acts of diversion. The full extent of the monstrous moral and political depravity of these men, their despicable villainy and treachery, concealed by hypocritical professions of loyalty to the party, were revealed at a trial in Moscow, 1936. The chief instigator and ringleader of this gang of assassins and spies was Judas Trotsky. Trotsky's assistants and agents in carrying out his counter-revolutionary instructions were Zinoviev, Kamenev and their Trotskyite underlings. They were preparing to bring about the defeat of the USSR in the event of attack by imperialist countries. They had become defeatists with regard to the workers and peasant state. They had become despicable tools and agents of the German and Japanese fascists. The main lesson which the party organizations had to draw from the trials of the persons implicated in the foul murder of S.M. Kirov was that they must put an end to their own political blindness and political heedlessness, and must increase their vigilance and the vigilance of all party members. In a circular letter to party organizations on the subject of the foul murder of S.M. Kirov, the Central Committee of the party stated, A. We must put an end to the opportunist complacency engendered by the enormous assumption that as we grow stronger the enemy will become tamer and more inoffensive. This assumption is an utter fallacy. It is a recrudescence of the right deviation, which assured all and sundry that our enemies would little by little creep into socialism and in the end become real socialists. The Bolsheviks have no business to rest on their laurels. They have no business to sleep at their posts. What we need is not complacency, but vigilance, real Bolshevik revolutionary vigilance. It should be remembered that the more hopeless the position of the enemies, the more eagerly will they dutch at extreme measures, as the only recourse of the doomed in their struggle against the Soviet power. We must remember this, and be vigilant. B. We must properly organize the teaching of the history of the party to party members, the study of all and sundry anti-party groups in the history of our party, their methods of combating the party line, their tactics and, still more the tactics and methods of our party in combating anti-party groups, the tactics and methods which have enabled our party to vanquish and demolish these groups. Party members should not only know how the party combated and vanquished the constitutional Democrats, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks and anarchists, but also how it combated and vanquished the Trotskyites, the democratic centralists, the workers, opposition, the Zinovievites, the right deviators, the right leftist freaks and the like. It should never be forgotten that a knowledge and understanding of the history of our party is a most important and essential means of fully ensuring the revolutionary vigilance of the party members. Of enormous importance in this period was the purge of the party ranks from adventitious and alien elements, begun in 1933. And especially the careful verification of the records of party members and the exchange of old party cards for new ones undertaken after the foul murder of S.M. Kirov. Prior to the verification of the records of party members, irresponsibility and negligence in the handling of party cards had prevailed in many party organizations. In a number of the organizations utterly intolerable chaos in the registration of communists was revealed, a state of affairs which enemies had been turning to their nefarious ends, using the possession of a party card as a screen for espionage, wrecking, etc. Many leaders of party organizations had entrusted the enrollment of new members and the issuance of party cards to persons in minor positions, and often even to party members of untested reliability. In a circular letter to all organizations dated May 13, 1935, on the subject of the registration, safekeeping and issuance of party cards, the Central Committee instructed all organizations to make a careful verification of the records of party members and to establish Bolshevik order in our own party home. The verification of the records of party members was of great political value. In connection with the report of Comrade Yezhov, Secretary of the Central Committee, on the results of the verification of the records of party members, a plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the party adopted a resolution on December 25, 1935, declaring that this verification was an organizational and political measure of enormous importance in strengthening the ranks of the CPSU-B. After the verification of the records of party members and the exchange of party cards, the admission of new members into the party was resumed. In this connection, the Central Committee of the CPSU-B demanded that new members should not be admitted into the party wholesale, but on the basis of a strictly individual enrollment of people really advanced and really devoted to the cause of the working class, the finest people of our country, drawn above all from among the workers, and also from among peasants and active intelligentsia, who had been tried and tested in various sectors of the struggle for socialism. In resuming the admission of new members to the party, the Central Committee instructed party organizations to bear in mind that hostile elements would persist in their attempts to worm their way into the ranks of the CPSU-B. Consequently, it is the task of every party organization to increase Bolshevik vigilance to the utmost, to hold aloft the banner of the Leninist party, and to safeguard the ranks of the party from the penetration of alien, hostile and adventitious elements. Resolution of the Central Committee of the CPSU-B, September 29, 1936, published in Pravda No. 270, 1936. Purging and consolidating its ranks, destroying the enemies of the party and relentlessly combating distortions of the party line, the Bolshevik Party rallied closer than ever around its Central Committee, under whose leadership the party and the Soviet land now passed to a new stage, the completion of the construction of a classless, socialist society. BRIEFSUMMARY. In the period 1930–34, the Bolshevik Party solved what was, after the winning of power, the most difficult historical problem of the proletarian revolution, namely, to get the millions of small peasant owners to adopt the path of collective farming, the path of socialism. The elimination of the kulaks, the most numerous of the exploiting classes, and the adoption of collective farming by the bulk of the peasants led to the destruction of the last roots of capitalism in the country, to the final victory of socialism in agriculture, and to the complete consolidation of the Soviet power in the countryside. After overcoming a number of difficulties of an organizational character, the collective farms became firmly established and entered upon the path of prosperity. The effect of the first five-year plan was to lay an unshakable foundation of a socialist economic system in our country in the shape of a first-class socialist heavy industry and collective mechanized agriculture, to put an end to unemployment, to abolish the exploitation of man by man, and to create the conditions for the steady improvement of the material and cultural standards of our working people. These colossal achievements were attained by the working class, the collective farmers, and the working people of our country generally, thanks to the bold, revolutionary and wise policy of the party and the government. The surrounding capitalist world, striving to undermine and disrupt the might of the USSR, worked with redoubled energy to organize gangs of assassins, wreckers and spies within the USSR. This hostile activity of the capitalist encirclement became particularly marked with the advent of fascism to power in Germany and Japan. In the Trotskyites and Zinovivites, fascism found faithful servants who were ready to spy, sabotage, commit acts of terrorism and diversion, and to work for the defeat of the USSR in order to restore capitalism. The Soviet government punished these degenerates with an iron hand, dealing ruthlessly with these enemies of the people and traitors to the country. CHAPTERTWELVE. The Bolshevik Party in the struggle to complete the building of the Socialist Society. Introduction of the new Constitution. 19351-937. 1. International situation in 1935–37. Temporary mitigation of the economic crisis. Beginning of a new economic crisis. Seizure of Ethiopia by Italy, German and Italian intervention in Spain. Japanese invasion of Central China. Beginning of Second Imperialist War. The economic crisis that had broken out in the capitalist countries in the latter half of 1929 lasted until the end of 1933. After that industry ceased to decline, the crisis was succeeded by a period of stagnation, and was then followed by a certain revival, a certain upward trend. But this upward trend was not of the kind that ushers in an industrial boom on a new and higher basis. World capitalist industry was unable even to reach the level of 1929, attaining by the middle of 1937 only 95 to 96% of that level. And already in the second half of 1937 a new economic crisis began, affecting first of all the United States. By the end of 1937 the number of unemployed in the USA had again risen to 10 million. In Great Britain, too, Unemployment was rapidly increasing. The capitalist countries thus found themselves faced with a new economic crisis before they had even recovered from the ravages of the preceding one. The result was that the contradictions between the imperialist countries, as likewise between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, grew still more acute. As a consequence, the aggressor states redoubled their efforts to recoup themselves for the losses caused by the economic crisis at home at the expense of other, poorly defended, countries. The two notorious aggressor states, Germany and Japan, were this time joined by a third, Italy. In 1935, Fascist Italy attacked Ethiopia and subjugated her. She did so without any reason or justification in International Law, She 331. Attacked her like a robber, without declaring war, as is now the vogue with the fascists. This was a blow not only at Ethiopia, but also at Great Britain, at her sea routes from Europe to India and to Asia generally. Great Britain vainly attempted to prevent Italy from establishing herself in Ethiopia. Italy later withdrew from the League of Nations so as to leave her hands free, and began to arm on an intensive scale. Thus, on the shortest sea routes between Europe and Asia, a new war knot was tied. Fascist Germany tore up the Versailles Peace Treaty by a unilateral act, and adopted a scheme for the forcible revision of the map of Europe. The German fascists made no secret of the fact that they were seeking to subjugate the neighboring states, or, at least, to seize such of their territories as were peopled by Germans. Accordingly, they planned first to seize Austria, then to strike at Czechoslovakia, then, maybe, at Poland, which also has a compact territory peopled by Germans and bordering on Germany, and then, well, then, we shall see. In the summer of 1936, Germany and Italy started military intervention against the Spanish Republic. Under the guise of supporting the Spanish fascists, they secured the opportunity of surreptitiously landing troops on Spanish territory, in the rear of France, and stationing their fleets in Spanish waters, in the zones of the Balearic Islands in Gibraltar in the south, the Atlantic Ocean in the west, and the Bay of Biscay in the north. At the beginning of 1938, the German fascists seized Austria, thus establishing themselves in the middle reaches of the Danube and expanding in the south of Europe, towards the Adriatic Sea. The German and Italian fascists extended their intervention in Spain, at the same time assuring the world that they were fighting the Spanish Reds, and harbored no other designs. But this was a crude and shallow camouflage designed to deceive simpletons. As a matter of fact, they were striking at Great Britain and France, by best riding the sea communications of these countries with their vast African and Asiatic colonial possessions. As to the seizure of Austria, this at any rate could not be passed off as a struggle against the Versailles Treaty, as part of Germany's effort to protect her national interests by recovering territory lost in the First Imperialist War. Austria had not formed part of Germany, either before or after the war. The forcible annexation of Austria was a glaring imperialist seizure of foreign territory. It left no doubt as to fascist Germany's designs to gain a dominant position on the West European continent. This was above all a blow at the interests of France and Great Britain. Thus, in the south of Europe, in the zone of Austria and the Adriatic, and in the extreme west of Europe, in the zone of Spain and the waters washing her shores, new war knots were tied. In 1937, the Japanese fascist militarists seized Piping, invaded central China and occupied Shanghai. Like the Japanese invasion of Manchuria several years earlier, the invasion of central China was effected by the customary Japanese method, in robber fashion, by the dishonest exploitation of various local incidents, engineered by the Japanese themselves, and in violation of all international standards, treaties, agreements, etc. The seizure of Tientsin and Shanghai placed the keys of the immense China market in the hands of Japan. As long as Japan holds Shanghai and Tientsin, she can at any moment oust Great Britain and the USA from central China, where they have huge investments. Of course, the heroic struggle of the Chinese people and their army against the Japanese invaders, the tremendous national revival in China, her huge resources of manpower and territory, and, lastly, the determination of the Chinese national government to fight the struggle for emancipation to a finish, until the invaders are completely driven out from Chinese territory, all go to show beyond a doubt that there is no future for the Japanese imperialists in China, and never will be. But it is nevertheless true that for the time being Japan holds the keys of China's trade, and that her war on China is in effect a most serious blow at the interests of Great Britain and the USA. Thus, in the Pacific, in the zone of China, one more war knot was tied. All these facts show that a second imperialist war has actually begun. It began stealthily, without any declaration of war. States and nations have, almost imperceptibly, slipped into the orbit of a second imperialist war. It was the three aggressor states, the fascist ruling circles of Germany, Italy and Japan, that began the war in various parts of the world. It is being waged over a huge expanse of territory, stretching from Gibraltar to Shanghai. It has already drawn over 500 million people into its orbit. In the final analysis, it is being waged against the capitalist interests of Great Britain, France and the USA, since its object is a redivision of the world and of the spheres of influence in favor of the aggressor countries and at the expense of the so-called democratic states. A distinguishing feature of the Second Imperialist War is that so far, it is being waged and extended by the aggressor powers, while the other powers, the democratic powers, against whom in fact the war is directed, pretend that it does not concern them, wash their hands of it, draw back, boast of their love of peace, scold the fascist aggressors, and surrender their positions to the aggressors bit by bit, at the same time asserting that they are preparing to resist. This war, it will be seen, is of a rather strange and one-sided character. But that does not prevent it from being a brutal war of unmitigated conquest waged at the expense of the poorly defended peoples of Ethiopia, Spain and China. It would be wrong to attribute this one-sided character of the war to the military or economic weakness of the democratic states. The democratic states are, of course, stronger than the fascist states. The one-sided character of the developing world war is due to the absence of a united front of the democratic states against the fascist powers. The so-called democratic states, of course, do not approve of the excesses of the fascist states and fear any accession of strength to the latter. But they fear even more the working-class movement in Europe and the movement of national emancipation in Asia, and regard fascism as an excellent antidote to these dangerous movements. For this reason, the ruling circles of the democratic states, especially the ruling conservative circles of Great Britain, confine themselves to a policy of pleading with the overweening fascist rulers not to go to extremes, at the same time giving them to understand that they fully comprehend, and on the whole sympathize with their reactionary police policy towards the working-class movement and the national emancipation movement. In this respect, the ruling circles of Britain are roughly pursuing the same policy as was pursued under T.S. by the Russian liberal monarchist bourgeois, who, while fearing the excesses of Tsarist policy, feared the people even more, and therefore resorted to a policy of pleading with the Tsar and, consequently, of conspiring with the Tsar against the people. As we know, the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie of Russia paid dearly for this dual policy. It may be presumed that history will exact retribution also from the ruling circles of Britain, and of their friends in France and the USA. Clearly, the USSR could not shut its eyes to such a turn in the international situation and ignore the ominous events. Any war, however small, started by the aggressors, constitutes a menace to the peaceable countries. The Second Imperialist War, which has so, imperceptibly, stolen upon the nations and has involved over 500 million people, is bound all the more to represent a most serious danger to all nations. And to the USSR in the first place. This is eloquently borne out by the formation of the anti-communist bloc by Germany, Italy and Japan. Therefore, our country, while pursuing its policy of peace, set to work to further strengthen its frontier defenses and the fighting efficiency of its Red Army and Navy. Towards the end of 1934, the USSR joined the League of Nations. It did so in the knowledge that the League, in spite of its weakness, might nevertheless serve as a place where aggressors can be exposed, and as a certain instrument of peace, however feeble, that might hinder the outbreak of war. The Soviet Union considered that in times like these even so weak an international organization as the League of Nations should not be ignored. In May 1935, a treaty of mutual assistance against possible attack by aggressors was signed between France and the USSR. A similar treaty was simultaneously concluded between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. In March 1936, the USSR signed a treaty of mutual assistance with the Mongolian People's Republic, and in August 1937 a pact of non-aggression with the Republic of China. 2. Further progress of industry and agriculture in the USSR's second five-year plan fulfilled ahead of time. Reconstruction of agriculture and completion of collectivization. Importance of cadres. Stakhanov movement. Rising standard of welfare. Rising cultural standard. Strength of the Soviet Revolution. Whereas, 3 years after the economic crisis of 1930-33, a new economic crisis began in the capitalist countries, in the USSR industry continued to make steady progress during the whole of this period. Whereas by the middle of 1937 world capitalist industry, as a whole, had barely attained 95 to 96% of the level of production of 1929, only to be caught in the throes of a new crisis in the second half of 1937, the industry of the USSR in its steady cumulative progress, had by the end of 1937 attained 428% of the output of 1929, or over 700% of the pre-war output. These achievements were a direct result of the policy of reconstruction so persistently pursued by the party and the government. The result of these achievements was that the second five-year plan of industry was fulfilled ahead of time. It was completed by April 1, 1937, that is, in 4 years and 3 months. This was a most important victory for socialism. Progress in agriculture presented very much the same picture. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, total area under all crops increased from I05,000,000 hectares in I9-I3 pre-war to I35 million hectares in I9-37. The grain harvest increased from 4,800,000,000 poods in I9-I3 to 6,800,000,000 poods in I9-37, the raw cotton crop from 44 million poods to I54 million poods, the flax crop, fiber, from I9 million poods to 3I,000,000 poods, the sugar beet crop from 654 million poods to I32,000,000 poods, and the oilseed crop from I29 million poods to 306 million poods. It should be mentioned that in I9-37 the collective farms alone, without the state farms, produced a marketable surplus of over I700 million poods of grain, which was at least 400 million poods more than the landlords, kulaks and peasants together marketed in nona-iodine triiodide. Only one branch of agriculture, livestock farming, still lagged behind the pre-war level and continued to progress at a slower rate. As to collectivization in agriculture, it might be considered completed. The number of peasant households that had joined the collective farms by I9-37 was I8,500,000 or 93% of the total number of peasant households, while the grain crop area of the collective farms amounted to 99% of the total grain crop area of the peasants. The fruits of the reconstruction of agriculture and of the extensive supply of tractors and machinery for agricultural purposes were now manifest. As a result of the completion of the reconstruction of industry and agriculture, the national economy was now abundantly supplied with first-class technique. Industry, agriculture, the transport system and the army had received huge quantities of modern technique, machinery and machine tools, tractors and agricultural machines, locomotives and steamships, artillery and tanks, aeroplanes and warships. Tens and hundreds of thousands of trained people were required, people capable of harnessing all this technique and getting the most out of it. Without a sufficient number of people who had mastered technique, there was a risk of technique becoming so much dead and unused metal. This was a serious danger, a result of the fact that the growth in the number of trained people, cadres, capable of harnessing, making full use of technique was not keeping pace with, and even lagging far behind, the spread of technique. Matters were further complicated by the fact that a considerable number of our industrial executives did not realize this danger and believed that technique would just do the job by itself. Whereas, formerly, they had underrated the importance of technique and treated it with disdain, now they began to overrate it and turn it into a fetish. They did not realize that without people who had mastered technique, technique was a dead thing. They did not realize that to make technique highly productive, people who had mastered technique were required. Thus, the problem of cadres who had mastered technique became one of prime importance. The executives who displayed an excessive zeal for technique and a consequent underestimation of the importance of trained people, cadres, had to have their attention turned to the study and mastery of technique, and to the necessity of doing everything to train numerous cadres capable of harnessing technique and getting the most out of it. Whereas formerly, at the beginning of the Reconstruction period, when the country suffered from a dearth of technique, the party had issued the slogan, "Technique in the period of Reconstruction decides everything." Now, when there was an abundance of technique, when the Reconstruction had in the main been completed, and when the country was experiencing an acute dearth of cadres, it became incumbent on the party to issue a new slogan, one that would focus attention, not so much on technique, as on people, on cadres capable of utilizing technique to the full. Of great importance in this respect was the speech made by Comrade Stalin to the graduates from the Red Army academies in May 1935. Formerly, said Comrade Stalin, we used to say that technique decides everything. This slogan helped us to put an end to the dearth in technique and to create a vast technical base in every branch of activity for the equipment of our people with first-class technique. That is very good, but it is not enough by far. In order to set technique going and to utilize it to the full, we need people who have mastered technique, we need cadres capable of mastering and utilizing this technique according to all the rules of the art. Without people who have mastered technique, technique is dead. In the charge of people who have mastered technique, technique can and should perform miracles. If in our first-class mills and factories, in our state farms and collective farms and in our Red Army we had sufficient cadres capable of harnessing this technique, our country would secure results 3 times and 4 times as great as at present. That is why emphasis must now be laid on people, on cadres, on workers who have mastered technique. That is why the old slogan, "Technique decides everything," which is a reflection of a period already past, a period in which we suffered from a dearth of technique, must now be replaced by a new slogan, the slogan, "Cadres decide everything." That is the main thing now. It is time to realize that of all the valuable capital the world possesses, the most valuable and most decisive is people, cadres. It must be realized that under our present conditions, cadres decide everything. If we have good and numerous cadres in industry, agriculture, transport and the army, our country will be invincible. If we do not have such cadres, we shall be lame on both legs. Thus the prime task now was to accelerate the training of technical cadres and rapidly to master the new technique with the object of securing a continued rise in productivity of labor. The most striking example of the growth of such cadres, of the mastering of the new technique by our people, and of the continued rise in productivity of labor was the Stakhanov movement. It originated and developed in the Donets Basin, in the coal industry, and spread to other branches of industry, to the railways, and then to agriculture. It was called the Stakhanov movement after its originator, Alexei Stakhanov, a coal hewer in the central Irmino colliery, Donets Basin. Stakhanov had been preceded by Nikita Izotov, who had broken all previous records in coal hewing. On August 31, 1935, Stakhanov hewed 102 tons of coal in one shift and thus fulfilled the standard output 14 times over. This inaugurated a mass movement of workers and collective farmers for raising the standards of output, for a new advance in productivity of labor. Busygin in the automobile industry, Smetana in the shoe industry, Krivonos on the railways, Masinsky in the timber industry, Evdokia Vinogradova and Maria Vinogradova in the textile industry, Maria Demchenko, Maria Natenko, P. Angelina, Palagutin, Kolosov, Borin and Kavardak in agriculture. These were the first pioneers of the Stakhanov movement. They were followed by other pioneers, whole battalions of them, who surpassed the productivity of labor of the earlier pioneers. Tremendous stimulus was given to the Stakhanov movement by the First All-Union Conference of Stakhanovites held in the Kremlin in November 1935, and by the speech Comrade Stalin made there. The Stakhanov movement, Comrade Stalin said in this speech, is the expression of a new wave of socialist emulation, a new and higher stage of socialist emulation. In the past, some 3 years ago, in the period of the first stage of socialist emulation, socialist emulation was not necessarily associated with modern technique. At that time, in fact, we had hardly any modern technique. The present stage of socialist emulation, the Stakhanov movement, on the other hand, is necessarily associated with modern technique. The Stakhanov movement would be inconceivable without a new and higher technique. We have before us people like Comrade Stakhanov, Busygin, Smetana, Krivonos, the Vinogradas and many others, new people, working men and women, who have completely mastered the technique of their jobs, have harnessed it and driven ahead. We had no such people, or hardly any such people, some 3 years ago. The significance of the Stakhanov movement lies in the fact that it is a movement which is smashing the old technical standards, because they are inadequate, which in a number of cases is surpassing the productivity of labor of the foremost capitalist countries, and is thus creating the practical possibility of further consolidating socialism in our country, of converting our country into the most prosperous of all countries. Describing the methods of work of the Stakhanovites, and bringing out the tremendous significance of the Stakhanov movement for the future of our country, Comrade Stalin went on to say. Look at our comrades, the Stakhanovites, more closely. What type of people are they? They are mostly young or middle-aged working men and women, people with culture and technical knowledge, who show examples of precision and accuracy in work, who are able to appreciate the time factor in work and who have learned to count not only the minutes, but also the seconds. The majority of them have taken the technical minimum courses and are continuing their technical education. They are free of the conservatism and stagnation of certain engineers, technicians and business executives. They are marching boldly forward, smashing the antiquated technical standards and creating new and higher standards. They are introducing amendments into the designed capacities and economic plans drawn up by the leaders of our industry. They often supplement and correct what the engineers and technicians have to say. They often teach them and impel them forward, for they are people who have completely mastered the technique of their job and who are able to squeeze out of technique the maximum that can be squeezed out of it. Today the Stakhanovites are still few in number, but who can doubt that tomorrow there will be 10 times more of them? Is it not clear that the Stakhanovites are innovators in our industry, that the Stakhanov movement represents the future of our industry, that it contains the seed of the future rise in the cultural and technical level of the working class, that it opens to us the path by which alone can be achieved those high indices of productivity of labor which are essential for the transition from socialism to communism and for the elimination of the distinction between mental labor and manual labor. The spread of the Stakhanov movement and the fulfillment of the Second Five-Year Plan ahead of time created the conditions for a new rise in the standard of welfare and culture of the working people. During the period of the Second Five-Year Plan, real wages of workers and office employees had more than doubled. The total payroll increased from 34 billion rubles in 1933 to 81 billion rubles in 1937. The State Social Insurance Fund increased from 4,600 million rubles to 5,600 million rubles in the same period. In 1937 alone, About 10 billion rubles were expended on the state insurance of workers and employees, on improving living conditions and on meeting cultural requirements, on sanatoria, health resorts, rest homes and on medical service. In the countryside, the collective farm system had been definitely consolidated. This was greatly assisted by the rules of the agricultural artel, adopted by the Second Congress of Collective Farm Shock Workers in February 1935, and the assignment to the collective farms of the land cultivated by them in perpetual tenure. The consolidation of the collective farm system put an end to poverty and insecurity among the rural population. Whereas formerly, some 3 years earlier, the collective farmers had received 1 or 2 kilograms of grain per workday unit, now the majority of the collective farmers in the grain-growing regions were receiving from 5 to 12 kilograms, and many as much as 20 kilograms per workday unit, besides other kinds of produce and money income. There were millions of collective farm households in the grain-growing regions who now received as their yearly returns from 500 to 1,500 poods of grain, and in the cotton, sugar beet, flax, livestock, grape growing, citrus fruit growing and fruit and vegetable growing regions, tens of thousands of rubles in annual income. The collective farms had become prosperous. It was now the chief concern of the household of a collective farmer to build new granaries and storehouses, and as much as the old storage places, which were designed for a meager annual supply, no longer met even 1/10 of the household's requirements. In 1936, in view of the rising standard of welfare of the people, the government passed a law prohibiting abortion, at the same time adopting an extensive program for the building of maternity homes, nurseries, milk centers and kindergartens. In 1936, 2,174 million rubles were assigned for these measures, as compared with 875 million rubles in 1935. A law was passed providing for considerable grants to large families. Grants to a total of over 1 billion rubles were made in 1937 under this law. The introduction of universal compulsory education and the building of new schools led to the rapid cultural progress of the people. Schools were built in large numbers all over the country. The number of pupils in elementary and intermediate schools increased from 8 million in 1914 to 28 million in the school year 1936-37. The number of university students increased from 112,000 to 542,000 in the same period. This was a veritable cultural revolution. The rise in the standard of welfare and culture of the masses was a reflection of the strength, might and invincibility of our Soviet Revolution. Revolutions in the past perished because, while giving the people freedom, they were unable to bring about any serious improvement in their material and cultural conditions. Therein lay their chief weakness. Our revolution differs from all other revolutions in that it not only freed the people from TSRdom and capitalism, but also brought about a radical improvement in the welfare and cultural condition of the people. Therein lies its strength and invincibility. Our proletarian revolution, said Comrade Stalin at the first All-Union Conference of Stakhanovites, is the only revolution in the world which had the opportunity of showing the people not only political results but also material results. Of all workers' revolutions we know only one which managed to achieve power. That was the Paris Commune. But it did not last long. True, it endeavored to smash the fetters of capitalism, but it did not have time enough to smash them, and still less to show the people the beneficial material results of revolution. Our revolution is the only one which not only smashed the fetters of capitalism and brought the people freedom, but also succeeded in creating the material conditions of a prosperous life for the people. Therein lies the strength and invincibility of our revolution. 3. 8th Congress of Soviets. Adoption of the new Constitution of the USSR. In February 1935, the 7th Congress of Soviets of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics passed a decision to change the Constitution of the USSR which had been adopted in 1924. The change of the Constitution was necessitated by the vast changes that had taken place in the life of the USSR since the first Constitution of the Soviet Union had been adopted in 1924. During this period the relation of class forces within the country had completely changed. A new socialist industry had been created, the kulaks had been smashed, the collective farm system had triumphed, and the socialist ownership of the means of production had been established in every branch of national economy as the basis of Soviet society. The victory of socialism made possible the further democratization of the electoral system and the introduction of universal, equal and direct suffrage with secret ballot. The new Constitution of the USSR was drafted by a Constitution Commission set up for the purpose, under the chairmanship of Comrade Stalin. The draft was thrown open to nationwide discussion, which lasted 5.5 months. It was then submitted to the extraordinary 8th Congress of Soviets. The 8th Congress of Soviets, specially convened to approve or reject the draft of the new Constitution of the USSR, met in November 1936. Reporting to the Congress on the draft of the new Constitution, Comrade Stalin enumerated the principal changes that had taken place in the Soviet Union since the adoption of the 1924 Constitution. The 1924 Constitution had been drawn up in the early period of NEP. At that time the Soviet government still permitted the development of capitalism alongside of the development of socialism. The Soviet government planned in the course of competition between the two systems, the capitalist system and the socialist system, to organize and ensure the victory of socialism over capitalism in the economic field. The question, who will win, had not yet been settled. Industry, with its old and inadequate technical equipment, had not attained even the pre-war level. Even less enviable was the picture presented by agriculture. The state farms and collective farms were mere islands in a boundless ocean of individual peasant farms. The question then was not of eliminating the kulaks, but merely of restricting them. The socialist sector accounted for only about 50% of the country's trade. Entirely different was the picture presented by the USSR in 1936. By that time the economic life of the country had undergone a complete change. The capitalist elements had been entirely eliminated and the socialist system had triumphed in all spheres of economic life. There was now a powerful socialist industry which had increased output 7 times compared with the pre-war output and had completely ousted private industry. Mechanized socialist farming in the form of collective farms and state farms, equipped with up-to-date machinery and run on the largest scale in the world, had triumphed in agriculture. By 1936, the kulaks had been completely eliminated as a class, and the individual peasants no longer played any important role in the economic life of the country. Trade was entirely concentrated in the hands of the state and the cooperatives. The exploitation of man by man had been abolished forever. Public, socialist ownership of the means of production had been firmly established as the unshakable foundation of the new socialist system in all branches of economic life. In the new socialist society, crises, poverty, unemployment and destitution had disappeared forever. The conditions had been created for a prosperous and cultured life for all members of Soviet society. The class composition of the population of the Soviet Union, said Comrade Stalin in his report, had changed correspondingly. The landlord class and the old big imperialist bourgeoisie had already been eliminated in the period of the Civil War. During the years of socialist construction all the exploiting elements, capitalists, merchants, kulaks and profiteers, had been eliminated. Only insignificant remnants of the eliminated exploiting classes persisted, and their complete elimination was a matter of the very near future. The working people of the USSR, workers, peasants and intellectuals, had undergone profound change in the period of socialist construction. The working class had ceased to be an exploited class bereft of means of production, as it is under capitalism. It had abolished capitalism, taken away the means of production from the capitalists and turned them into public property. It had ceased to be a proletariat in the proper, the old meaning of the term. The proletariat of the USSR, possessing the state power, had been transformed into an entirely new class. It had become a working class emancipated from exploitation, a working class which had abolished the capitalist economic system and had established socialist ownership of the means of production. Hence, it was a working class the like of which the history of mankind had never known before. No less profound were the changes that had taken place in the condition of the peasantry of the USSR. In the old days, over 20 million scattered individual peasant households, small and middle, had delved away in isolation on their small plots, using backward technical equipment. They were exploited by landlords, kulaks, merchants, profiteers, usurers, etc. Now an entirely new peasantry had grown up in the USSR. There were no longer any landlords, kulaks, merchants, and usurers to exploit the peasants. The overwhelming majority of the peasant households had joined the collective farms, which were based not on private ownership, but on collective ownership of the means of production, collective ownership which had grown from collective labor. This was a new type of peasantry, a peasantry emancipated from all exploitation. It was a peasantry the like of which the history of mankind had never known before. The intelligentsia in the USSR had also undergone a change. It had for the most part become an entirely new intelligentsia. The majority of its members came from the ranks of the workers and peasants. It no longer served capitalism, as the old intelligentsia did, it served socialism. It had become an equal member of the socialist society. Together with the workers and peasants, it was building a new socialist society. This was a new type of intelligentsia, which served the people and was emancipated from all exploitation. It was an intelligentsia the like of which the history of mankind had never known before. Thus the old class dividing lines between the working people of the USSR were being obliterated, the old class exclusiveness was disappearing. The economic and political contradictions between the workers, the peasants and the intellectuals were declining and becoming obliterated. The foundation for the moral and political unity of society had been created. These profound changes in the life of the USSR, these decisive achievements of socialism in the USSR, were reflected in the new Constitution. According to the new Constitution, Soviet society consists of two friendly classes, the workers and peasants, class distinctions between the two still remaining. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a socialist state of workers and peasants. The political foundation of the USSR is formed by the Soviets of Deputies of the Working People, which developed and grew strong as a result of the overthrow of the power of the landlords and capitalists and the achievement of the dictatorship of the proletariat. All power in the USSR belongs to the working people of town and country as represented by the Soviets of Deputies of the Working People. The highest organ of state power in the USSR is the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR, consisting of two chambers with equal rights, the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities, is elected by the citizens of the USSR for a term of 4 years on the basis of universal, equal and direct suffrage by secret ballot. Elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, as to all Soviets of Deputies of the Working People, are universal. This means that all citizens of the USSR who have reached the age of 18, irrespective of race or nationality, religion, standard of education, domicile, social origin, property status or past activities, have the right to vote in the election of deputies and to be elected, with the exception of the insane and persons convicted by court of law to sentences including deprivation of electoral rights. Elections of deputies are equal. This means that each citizen is entitled to one vote and that all citizens participate in the elections on an equal footing. Elections of deputies are direct. This means that all Soviets of Deputies of the Working People, from rural and city Soviets of Deputies of the Working People up to and including the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, are elected by the citizens by direct vote. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR at a joint sitting of both chambers elects the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet and the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR. The economic foundation of the USSR is the socialist system of economy and the socialist ownership of the means of production. In the USSR is realized the socialist principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work. All citizens of the USSR are guaranteed the right to work, the right to rest and leisure, the right to education, the right to maintenance in old age and in case of sickness or disability. Women are accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of life. The equality of the citizens of the USSR, irrespective of their nationality or race, is an indefeasible law. Freedom of conscience and freedom of anti-religious propaganda is recognized for all citizens. In order to strengthen socialist society, the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech, press, assembly and meeting, the right to unite in public organizations, inviolability of person, inviolability of domicile and privacy of correspondence, the right of asylum for foreign citizens persecuted for defending the interests of the working people or for their scientific activities, or for their struggle for national liberation. The new Constitution also imposes serious duties on all citizens of the USSR. The duty of observing the laws, maintaining labor discipline, honestly performing public duties, respecting the rules of the socialist community, safeguarding and strengthening public, socialist property, and defending the socialist fatherland. To defend the fatherland is the sacred duty of every citizen of the USSR. Dealing with the right of citizens to unite in various societies, one of the articles of the Constitution states, "The most active and politically conscious citizens in the ranks of the working class and other strata of the working people unite in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, which is the vanguard of the working people in their struggle to strengthen and develop the socialist system and which represents the leading core of all organizations of the working people, both public and state." The 8th Congress of Soviets unanimously approved and adopted the draft of the new Constitution of the USSR. The Soviet country thus acquired a new constitution, a constitution embodying the victory of socialism and workers' and peasants' democracy. In this way the constitution gave legislative embodiment to the epoch-making fact that the USSR had entered a new stage of development, the stage of the completion of the building of a socialist society and the gradual transition to communist society, where the guiding principle of social life will be the communist principle, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. 4. Liquidation of the remnants of the Bukharin-Trotsky gang of spies, wreckers and traitors to the country. Preparations for the election of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Broad inter-party democracy as the party's course. Election of Supreme Soviet of USSR. In 1937, new facts came to light regarding the fiendish crimes of the Bukharin-Trotsky gang. The trial of Pyatakov, Roddick and others, the trial of Tukhachevsky, Yakir and others, and, lastly, the trial of Bukharin, Rykov, Krestinsky, Rosengoltz and others, all showed that the Bukharinites and Trotskyites had long ago joined to form a common band of enemies of the people, operating as the bloc of rights in Trotskyites. The trials showed that these dregs of humanity, in conjunction with the enemies of the people, Trotsky, Zinoviev and Kamenev, had been in conspiracy against Lenin, the party and the Soviet state ever since the early days of the October Socialist Revolution. The insidious attempts to thwart the Peace of Brest-Litovsk at the beginning of 1918, the plot against Lenin and the conspiracy with the left, socialist revolutionaries for the arrest and murder of Lenin, Stalin and Sverdlov in the spring of 1918, the villainous shot that wounded Lenin in the summer of 1918, the revolt of the left, socialist revolutionaries in the summer of 1918, the deliberate aggravation of differences in the party in 1921 with the object of undermining and overthrowing Lenin's leadership from within, the attempts to overthrow the party leadership during Lenin's illness and after his death, the betrayal of state secrets and the supply of information of an espionage character to foreign espionage services, the vile assassination of Kirov, the acts of wrecking, diversion and explosions, the dastardly murder of Menjinsky, Kuibyshev and Gorky. All these and similar villainies over a period of 20 years were committed, it transpired, with the participation or under the direction of Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov and their henchmen, at the behest of espionage services of bourgeois states. The trials brought to light the fact that the Trotsky-Bukharin fiends, in obedience to the wishes of their masters, the espionage services of foreign states, had set out to destroy the party in the Soviet state, to undermine the defensive power of the country, to assist foreign military intervention, to prepare the way for the defeat of the Red Army, to bring about the dismemberment of the USSR, to hand over the Soviet maritime region to the Japanese, Soviet Byelorussia to the Poles, and the Soviet Ukraine to the Germans, to destroy the gains of the workers and collective farmers, and to restore capitalist slavery in the USSR. These White Guard pygmies, whose strength was no more than that of a gnat, apparently flattered themselves that they were the masters of the country, and imagined that it was really in their power to sell or give away the Ukraine, Byelorussia and the maritime region. These White Guard insects forgot that the real masters of the Soviet country were the Soviet people, and that the Rykovs, Bukharins, Zinovievs and Kamenevs were only temporary employees of the state, which could at any moment sweep them out from its offices as so much useless rubbish. These contemptible lackeys of the fascists forgot that the Soviet people had only to move a finger, and not a trace of them would be left. The Soviet court sentenced the Bukharin Trotsky fiends to be shot. The People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs carried out the sentence. The Soviet people approved the annihilation of the Bukharin Trotsky gang and passed on to next business. And the next business was to prepare for the election of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and to carry it out in an organized way. The party threw all its strength into the preparations for the elections. It held that the putting into effect of the new constitution of the USSR signified a turn in the political life of the country. This turn meant the complete democratization of the electoral system, the substitution of universal suffrage for restricted suffrage, equal suffrage for not entirely equal suffrage, direct elections for indirect elections, and secret ballot for open ballot. Before the introduction of the new constitution, there were restrictions of the franchise in the case of priests, former White Guards, former kulaks, and persons not engaged in useful labor. The new constitution abolished all franchise restrictions for these categories of citizens by making the election of deputies universal. Formerly, the election of deputies had been unequal, inasmuch as the bases of representation for the urban and rural populations differed. Now, however, all necessity for restrictions of equality of the suffrage had disappeared and all citizens were given the right to take part in the elections on an equal footing. Formerly, the elections of the intermediate and higher organs of Soviet power were indirect. Now, however, under the new constitution, all Soviets, from rural and urban up to and including the Supreme Soviet, were to be elected by the citizens directly. Formerly, deputies to the Soviets were elected by open ballot and the voting was for lists of candidates. Now, however, the voting for deputies was to be by secret ballot, and not by lists, but for individual candidates nominated in each electoral area. This was a definite turning point in the political life of the country. The new electoral system was bound to result, and actually did result, in an enhancement of the political activity of the people, in greater control by the masses over the organs of Soviet power, and in the increased responsibility of the organs of Soviet power to the people. In order to be fully prepared for this turn, the party had to be its moving spirit, and the leading role of the party in the forthcoming elections had to be fully ensured. But this could be done only if the party organizations themselves became thoroughly democratic in their everyday work, only if they fully observed the principles of democratic centralism in their inter-party life, as the party rules demanded, only if all organs of the party were elected, only if criticism and self-criticism in the party were developed to the full, only if the responsibility of the party bodies to the members of the party were complete, and if the members of the party themselves became thoroughly active. A report made by Comrade Zhdanov at the plenum of the Central Committee at the end of February 1937 on the subject of preparing the party organizations for the elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR revealed the fact that a number of party organizations were systematically violating the party rules and the principles of democratic centralism in their everyday work, substituting co-option for election, voting by lists for the voting for individual candidates, open ballot for secret ballot, etc. It was obvious that organizations in which such practices prevailed could not properly fulfill their tasks in the elections to the Supreme Soviet. It was therefore first of all necessary to put a stop to such anti-democratic practices in the party organizations and to reorganize party work on broad democratic lines. Accordingly, after hearing the report of Comrade Zhdanov, the plenum of the Central Committee resolved a. To reorganize party work on the basis of complete and unqualified observance of the principles of inter-party democracy as prescribed by the party rules. b. To put an end to the practice of co-opting members of party committees and to restore the principle of election of directing bodies of party organizations as prescribed by the party rules. c. To forbid voting by lists in the election of party bodies. Voting should be for individual candidates, all members of the party being guaranteed the unlimited right to challenge candidates and to criticize them. d. To introduce the secret ballot in the election of party bodies. e. To hold elections of party bodies in all party organizations, from the party committees of primary party organizations to the territorial and regional committees and the central committees of the national communist parties, the elections to be completed not later than May 20th. f. To charge all party organizations strictly to observe the provisions of the party rules with respect to the terms of office of party bodies, namely, to hold elections in primary party organizations once a year, in district and city organizations, once a year. In regional, territorial and republican organizations, every 18 months. g. To ensure that party organizations strictly adhere to the system of electing party committees at general factory meetings, and not to allow the latter to be replaced by delegate conferences. h. To put a stop to the practice prevalent in a number of primary party organizations whereby general meetings are virtually abolished and replaced by shop meetings and delegate conferences. In this way the party began its preparations for the forthcoming elections. This decision of the Central Committee was of tremendous political importance. Its significance lay not only in the fact that it inaugurated the party's campaign in the election of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, but also, and primarily, in the fact that it helped the party organizations to reorganize their work, to apply the principles of inter-party democracy, and to meet the elections to the Supreme Soviet fully prepared. The party decided to make the idea of an election bloc of communists and the non-party masses the keynote of its policy in developing the election campaign. The party entered the elections in a bloc, an alliance with the non-party masses, by deciding to put up in the electoral areas joint candidates with the non-party masses. This was something unprecedented and absolutely impossible in elections in bourgeois countries. But a bloc of communists and the non-party masses was something quite natural in our country, where hostile classes no longer exist and where the moral and political unity of all sections of the population is an incontestable fact. On December 7, 1937, the Central Committee of the party issued an address to the electors, which stated, on December 12, 1937, the working people of the Soviet Union will, on the basis of our socialist constitution, elect their deputies to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. The Bolshevik Party enters the elections in a bloc, an alliance with the non-party workers, peasants, office employees and intellectuals. The Bolshevik Party does not fence itself off from non-party people, but, on the contrary, enters the elections in a bloc, an alliance, with the non-party masses, in a bloc with the trade unions of the workers and office employees, with the Young Communist League and other non-party organizations and societies. Consequently, the candidates will be the joint candidates of the communists and the non-party mass. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, every non-party deputy will also be the deputy of the communists, just as every communist deputy will be the deputy of the non-party masses. The address of the Central Committee concluded with the following appeal to the electors. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks calls upon all communists and sympathizers to vote for the non-party candidates with the same unanimity as they should vote for the communist candidates. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks calls upon all non-party electors to vote for the communist candidates with the same unanimity as they will vote for the non-party candidates. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks calls upon all electors to appear at the polling stations on December I-2, I-937, as one man, to elect the deputies to the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities. There must not be a single elector who does not exercise his honorable right of electing deputies to the supreme organ of the Soviet state. There must not be a single active citizen who does not consider it his civic duty to assist in ensuring that all electors without exception take part in the elections of the Supreme Soviet. December I-2, I-937, should be a great holiday celebrating the union of the working people of all the nations of the USSR. Around the victorious banner of Lenin and Stalin. On December I-937, the eve of the elections, Comrade Stalin addressed the voters of the area in which he was nominated and described what type of public figures those whom the people choose, the deputies to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, should be. Comrade Stalin said, The electors, the people, must demand that their deputies should remain equal to their tasks. That in their work they should not sink to the level of political Philistines. That in their posts they should remain political figures of the Lenin type. That as public figures they should be as clear and definite as Lenin was. That they should be as fearless in battle and as merciless towards the enemies of the people as Lenin was. That they should be free from all panic, from any semblance of panic, when things begin to get complicated and some danger or other looms on the horizon. That they should be as free from all semblance of panic as Lenin was. That they should be as wise and deliberate in deciding complex problems requiring a comprehensive orientation and a comprehensive weighing of all pros and cons as Lenin was. That they should be as upright and honest as Lenin was. That they should love their people as Lenin did. The elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR took place on December 12 amidst great enthusiasm. They were something more than elections, they were a great holiday celebrating the triumph of the Soviet people, a demonstration of the great friendship of the peoples of the USSR. Of a total of 94 million electors, over 91 million, or 96.8%, voted. Of this number 89,844,000, or 98.6%, voted for the candidates of the bloc of the communists and the non-party masses. Only 632,000 persons, or less than 1%, voted against the candidates of the bloc of the communists and the non-party masses. All the candidates of the bloc were elected without exception. Thus, 90 million persons, by their unanimous vote, confirmed the victory of socialism in the USSR. This was a remarkable victory for the bloc of the communists and the non-party masses. It was a triumph for the Bolshevik Party. It was a brilliant confirmation of the moral and political unity of the Soviet people, to which Comrade Molotov had referred in a historic speech he delivered on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution. CONCLUSION. What are the chief conclusions to be drawn from the historical path traversed by the Bolshevik Party? What does the history of the CPSU teach us? 1. The history of the party teaches us, first of all, that the victory of the proletarian revolution, the victory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is impossible without a revolutionary party of the proletariat, a party free from opportunism, irreconcilable towards compromisers and capitulators, and revolutionary in its attitude towards the bourgeoisie and its state power. The history of the party teaches us that to leave the proletariat without such a party means to leave it without revolutionary leadership. And to leave it without revolutionary leadership means to ruin the cause of the proletarian revolution. The history of the party teaches us that the ordinary social democratic party of the West European type, brought up under conditions of civil peace, trailing in the wake of the opportunists, dreaming of social reforms, and dreading social revolution, cannot be such a party. The history of the party teaches us that only a party of the new type, a Marxist-Leninist party, a party of social revolution, a party capable of preparing the proletariat for decisive battles against the bourgeoisie and of organizing the victory of the proletarian revolution, can be such a party. The Bolshevik Party in the USSR is such a party. In the pre-revolutionary period, Comrade Stalin says, in the period of more or less peaceful development, when the parties of the Second International were the predominant force in the working-class movement and parliamentary forms of struggle were regarded as the principal forms, the party neither had nor could have had that great and decisive importance which it acquired afterwards, under conditions of open revolutionary battle. Defending the Second International against attacks made upon it, Kautsky says that the parties of the Second International are instruments of peace and not of war, and that for this very reason they were powerless to take any 353 important steps during the war, during the period of revolutionary action by the proletariat. That is quite true, but what does it mean? It means that the parties of the Second International are unfit for the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat, that they are not militant parties of the proletariat, leading the workers to power, but election machines adapted for parliamentary elections and parliamentary struggle. This, in fact, explains why, in the days when the opportunists of the Second International were in the ascendancy, it was not the party but its parliamentary group that was the chief political organization of the proletariat. It is well known that the party at that time was really an appendage and subsidiary of the parliamentary group. It goes without saying that under such circumstances and with such a party at the helm there could be no question of preparing the proletariat for revolution. But matters have changed radically with the dawn of the new period. The new period is one of open class collisions, of revolutionary action by the proletariat, of proletarian revolution, a period when forces are being directly mustered for the overthrow of imperialism and the seizure of power by the proletariat. In this period the proletariat is confronted with new tasks, the tasks of reorganizing all party work on new, revolutionary lines, of educating the workers in the spirit of revolutionary struggle for power, of preparing and moving up reserves, of establishing an alliance with the proletarians of neighboring countries, of establishing firm ties with the liberation movement in the colonies and dependent countries, etc., etc. To think that these new tasks can be performed by the old social democratic parties, brought up as they were in the peaceful conditions of parliamentarism, is to doom oneself to hopeless despair and inevitable defeat. If, with such tasks to shoulder, the proletariat remained under the leadership of the old parties, it would be completely unarmed and defenseless. It goes without saying that the proletariat could not consent to such a state of affairs. Hence the necessity for a new party, a militant party, a revolutionary party, one bold enough to lead the proletarians in the struggle for power, sufficiently experienced to find its bearings amidst the complex conditions of a revolutionary situation, and sufficiently flexible to steer clear of all submerged rocks in the path to its goal. Without such a party, it is useless even to think of overthrowing imperialism and achieving the dictatorship of the proletariat. This new party is the party of Leninism. Joseph Stalin, Leninism, Volume 1, pp. 87-8. 2. The history of the party further teaches us that a party of the working class cannot perform the role of leader of its class, cannot perform the role of organizer and leader of the proletarian revolution, unless it has mastered the advanced theory of the working class movement, the Marxist-Leninist theory. The power of the Marxist-Leninist theory lies in the fact that it enables the party to find the right orientation in any situation, to understand the interconnection of current events, to foresee their course and to perceive not only how and in what direction they are developing in the present, but how and in what direction they are bound to develop in the future. Only a party which has mastered the Marxist-Leninist theory can confidently advance and lead the working class forward. On the other hand, a party which has not mastered the Marxist-Leninist theory is compelled to grope its way, loses confidence in its actions and is unable to lead the working class forward. It may seem that all that is required for mastering the Marxist-Leninist theory is diligently to learn by heart isolated conclusions and propositions from the works of Marx, Engels and Lenin, learn to quote them at opportune times and rest at that, in the hope that the conclusions and propositions thus memorized will suit each and every situation and occasion. But such an approach to the Marxist-Leninist theory is altogether wrong. The Marxist-Leninist theory must not be regarded as a collection of dogmas, as a catechism, as a symbol of faith, and the Marxists themselves as pedants and dogmatists. The Marxist-Leninist theory is the science of the development of society, the science of the working class movement, the science of the proletarian revolution, the science of the building of the communist society. And as a science it does not and cannot stand still, but develops and perfects itself. Clearly, in its development it is bound to become enriched by new experience and new knowledge, and some of its propositions and conclusions are bound to change in the course of time, are bound to be replaced by new conclusions and propositions corresponding to the new historical conditions. Mastering the Marxist-Leninist theory does not at all mean learning all its formulas and conclusions by heart and clinging to their every letter. To master the Marxist-Leninist theory we must first of all learn to distinguish between its letter and substance. Mastering the Marxist-Leninist theory means assimilating the substance of this theory and learning to use it in the solution of the practical problems of the revolutionary movement under the varying conditions of the class struggle of the proletariat. Mastering the Marxist-Leninist theory means being able to enrich this theory with the new experience of the revolutionary movement, with new propositions and conclusions. It means being able to develop it and advance it without hesitating to replace, in accordance with the substance of the theory, such of its propositions and conclusions as have become antiquated by new ones corresponding to the new historical situation. The Marxist-Leninist theory is not a dogma but a guide to action. Before the Second Russian Revolution, February 1917, the Marxists of all countries assumed that the parliamentary democratic republic was the most suitable form of political organization of society in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism. It is true that in the 70s Marx stated that the most suitable form for the dictatorship of the proletariat was a political organization of the type of the Paris Commune, and not the parliamentary republic. But, unfortunately, Marx did not develop this proposition any further in his writings and it was committed to oblivion. Moreover, Engels' authoritative statement in his criticism of the draft of the Erfurt program in 1891, namely, that the democratic republic is the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, left no doubt that the Marxists continued to regard the democratic republic as the political form for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Engels' proposition later became a guiding principle for all Marxists, including Lenin. However, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and especially the Revolution of February 1917, advanced a new form of political organization of society, the Soviets of Workers' and Peasants' Deputies. As a result of a study of the experience of the two Russian revolutions, Lenin, on the basis of the theory of Marxism, arrived at the conclusion that the best political form for the dictatorship of the proletariat was not a parliamentary democratic republic, but a republic of Soviets. Proceeding from this, Lenin, in April 1917, during the period of transition from the bourgeois to the socialist revolution, issued the slogan of a Republic of Soviets as the best political form for the dictatorship of the proletariat. The opportunists of all countries clung to the parliamentary republic and accused Lenin of departing from Marxism and destroying democracy. But it was Lenin, of course, who was the real Marxist who had mastered the theory of Marxism, and not the opportunists, for Lenin was advancing the Marxist theory by enriching it with new experience, whereas the opportunists were dragging it back and transforming one of its propositions into a dogma. What would have happened to the party, to our revolution, to Marxism, if Lenin had been overawed by the letter of Marxism and had not had the courage to replace one of the old propositions of Marxism, formulated by Engels, by the new proposition regarding the Republic of Soviets, a proposition that corresponded to the new historical conditions? The party would have groped in the dark, the Soviets would have been disorganized, we should not have had a Soviet power, and the Marxist theory would have suffered a severe setback. The proletariat would have lost, and the enemies of the proletariat would have won. As a result of a study of pre-imperialist capitalism, Engels and Marx arrived at the conclusion that the socialist revolution could not be victorious in one country, taken singly, that it could be victorious only by a simultaneous stroke in all, or the majority of the civilized countries. That was in the middle of the 19th century. This conclusion later became a guiding principle for all Marxists. However, by the beginning of the 20th century, pre-imperialist capitalism had grown into imperialist capitalism, ascendant capitalism had turned into moribund capitalism. As a result of a study of imperialist capitalism, Lenin, on the basis of the Marxist theory, arrived at the conclusion that the old formula of Engels and Marx no longer corresponded to the new historical conditions, and that the victory of the socialist revolution was quite possible in one country, taken singly. The opportunists of all countries clung to the old formula of Engels and Marx and accused Lenin of departing from Marxism. But it was Lenin, of course, who was the real Marxist who had mastered the theory of Marxism, and not the opportunists, for Lenin was advancing the Marxist theory by enriching it with new experience, whereas the opportunists were dragging it back, mummifying it. What would have happened to the party, to our revolution, to Marxism, if Lenin had been overawed by the letter of Marxism and had not had the courage of theoretical conviction to discard one of the old conclusions of Marxism and to replace it by a new conclusion affirming that the victory of socialism in one country, taken singly, was possible, a conclusion which corresponded to the new historical conditions? The party would have groped in the dark, the proletarian revolution would have been deprived of leadership, and the Marxist theory would have begun to decay. The proletariat would have lost, and the enemies of the proletariat would have won. Opportunism does not always mean a direct denial of the Marxist theory or of any of its propositions and conclusions. Opportunism is sometimes expressed in the attempt to cling to certain of the propositions of Marxism that have already become antiquated and to convert them into a dogma, so as to retard the further development of Marxism and, consequently, to retard the development of the revolutionary movement of the proletariat. It may be said without fear of exaggeration that since the death of Engels, the master theoretician Lenin, and after Lenin, Stalin and the other disciples of Lenin, have been the only Marxists who have advanced the Marxist theory and who have enriched it with new experience in the new conditions of the class struggle of the proletariat. And just because Lenin and the Leninists have advanced the Marxist theory, Leninism is a further development of Marxism. It is Marxism in the new conditions of the class struggle of the proletariat, Marxism of the epoch of imperialism and proletarian revolutions, Marxism of the epoch of the victory of socialism on 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The Bolshevik Party could not have won in October 1917 if its foremost men had not mastered the theory of Marxism, if they had not learned to regard this theory as a guide to action, if they had not learned to advance the Marxist theory by enriching it with the new experience of the class struggle of the proletariat. Criticizing the German Marxists in America who had undertaken to lead the American working class movement, Engels wrote, "The Germans have not understood how to use their theory as a lever which could set the American masses in motion. They do not understand the theory themselves for the most part and treat it in a doctrinaire and dogmatic way, as something which has got to be learned off by heart and which will then supply all needs without more ado. To them it is a dogma and not a guide to action." Marx and Engels, Selected Correspondence, pp. 449-450. Criticizing Kamenev and some of the old Bolsheviks who in April 1917 clung to the old formula of a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry at a time when the revolutionary movement had gone on ahead and was demanding a transition to the socialist revolution, Lenin wrote, "Our teaching is not a dogma, but a guide to action," Marx and Engels always used to say, rightly ridiculing the learning and repetition by rote of formulas, which at best are only capable of outlining general tasks that are necessarily liable to be modified by the concrete economic and political conditions of each separate phase of the historical process. It is essential to realize the incontestable truth that a Marxist must take cognizance of real life, of the concrete realities, and must not continue to cling to a theory of yesterday. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ, ed. Vol. XX, pp. 100-101. 3. The history of the party further teaches us that unless the petty bourgeois parties which are active within the ranks of the working class and which push the backward sections of the working class into the arms of the bourgeoisie, thus splitting the unity of the working class, are smashed, the victory of the proletarian revolution is impossible. The history of our party is the history of the struggle against the petty bourgeois parties, the socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, anarchists and nationalists, and of the utter defeat of these parties. If these parties had not been vanquished and driven out of the ranks of the working class, the unity of the working class could not have been achieved, and if the working class had not been united, it would have been impossible to achieve the victory of the proletarian revolution. If these parties, which at first stood for the preservation of capitalism, and later, after the October Revolution, for the restoration of capitalism, had not been utterly defeated, it would have been impossible to preserve the dictatorship of the proletariat, to defeat the foreign armed intervention, and to build up socialism. It cannot be regarded as an accident that all the petty bourgeois parties, which styled themselves revolutionary and socialist parties in order to deceive the people, the socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, anarchists and nationalists, became counter-revolutionary parties even before the October Socialist Revolution, and later turned into agents of foreign bourgeois espionage services, into a gang of spies, wreckers, diversionists, assassins and traitors to the country. The unity of the proletariat in the epoch of social revolution, Lenin says, can be achieved only by the extreme revolutionary party of Marxism, and only by a relentless struggle against all other parties. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 26, page 50. 4. The history of the party further teaches us that unless the party of the working class wages an uncompromising struggle against the opportunists within its own ranks, unless it smashes the capitulators in its own midst, it cannot preserve unity and discipline within its ranks, it cannot perform its role of organizer and leader of the proletarian revolution, nor its role as the builder of the new, socialist society. The history of the development of the internal life of our party is the history of the struggle against the opportunist groups within the party, the economists, Mensheviks, Trotskyites, Bukharinites and nationalist deviators, and of the utter defeat of these groups. The history of our party teaches us that all these groups of capitulators were in point of fact agents of Menshevism within our party. The lees and dregs of Menshevism, the continuers of Menshevism. Like the Mensheviks, they acted as vehicles of bourgeois influence among the working class and in the party. The struggle for the liquidation of these groups within the party was therefore a continuation of the struggle for the liquidation of Menshevism. If we had not defeated the economists and the Mensheviks, we could not have built the party and led the working class to the proletarian revolution. If we had not defeated the Trotskyites and Bukharinites, we could not have brought about the conditions that are essential for the building of socialism. If we had not defeated the nationalist deviators of all shades and colors, we could not have educated the people in the spirit of internationalism, we could not have safeguarded the banner of the great amity of the nations of the USSR, and we could not have built up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It may seem to some that the Bolsheviks devoted far too much time to this struggle against the opportunist elements within the party, that they overrated their importance. But that is altogether wrong. Opportunism in our midst is like an ulcer in a healthy organism, and must not be tolerated. The party is the leading detachment of the working class, its advanced fortress, its general staff. Skeptics, opportunists, capitulators and traitors cannot be tolerated on the directing staff of the working class. If, while it is carrying on a life and death fight against the bourgeoisie, there are capitulators and traitors on its own staff, within its own fortress, the working class will be caught between two fires, from the front and the rear. Clearly, such a struggle can only end in defeat. The easiest way to capture a fortress is from within. To attain victory, the party of the working class, its directing staff, its advanced fortress, must first be purged of capitulators, deserters, scabs and traitors. It cannot be regarded as an accident that the Trotskyites, Bukharinites and nationalist deviators who fought Lenin in the party ended just as the Menshevik and socialist revolutionary parties did, namely, by becoming agents of fascist espionage services, by turning spies, wreckers, assassins, diversionists and traitors to the country. With reformists, Mensheviks, in our ranks, Lenin said, it is impossible to achieve victory in the proletarian revolution, it is impossible to retain it. That is obvious in principle, and it has been strikingly confirmed by the experience both of Russia and Hungary. In Russia, difficult situations have arisen many times when the Bolsheviks, reformists and petty bourgeois Democrats remained in our party. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 25, pp. 462-63. Our party, Comrade Stalin says, succeeded in creating internal unity and unexampled cohesion of its ranks primarily because it was able in good time to purge itself of the opportunist pollution, because it was able to rid its ranks of the liquidators, the Mensheviks. Proletarian parties develop and become strong by purging themselves of opportunists and reformists, social imperialists and social chauvinists, social patriots and social pacifists. The party becomes strong by purging itself of opportunist elements. Joseph Stalin, Leninism. 5. The history of the party further teaches us that a party cannot perform its role as leader of the working class if, carried away by success, it begins to grow conceited, ceases to observe the defects in its work, and fears to acknowledge its mistakes and frankly and honestly to correct them in good time. A party is invincible if it does not fear criticism and self-criticism, if it does not gloss over the mistakes and defects in its work, if it teaches and educates its cadres by drawing the lessons from the mistakes in party work, and if it knows how to correct its mistakes in time. A party perishes if it conceals its mistakes, if it glosses over sore problems, if it covers up its shortcomings by pretending that all is well, if it is intolerant of criticism and self-criticism, if it gives way to self-complacency and vainglory, and if it rests on its laurels. The attitude of a political party towards its own mistakes, Lenin says, is one of the most important and surest ways of judging how earnest the party is and how it in practice fulfills its obligations towards its class and the toiling masses. Frankly admitting a mistake, ascertaining the reasons for it, analyzing the conditions which led to it, and thoroughly discussing the means of correcting it. That is the earmark of a serious party. That is the way it should perform its duties. That is the way it should educate and train the class, and then the masses. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 25, page 200. And further, all revolutionary parties, which have hitherto perished, did so because they grew conceited, failed to see where their strength lay, and feared to speak of their weaknesses. Come them. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 27, pp. 260-61. 6. Lastly, the history of the party teaches us that unless it has wide connections with the masses, unless it constantly strengthens these connections, unless it knows how to hearken to the voice of the masses and understand their urgent needs, unless it is prepared not only to teach the masses, but to learn from the masses, a party of the working class cannot be a real mass party capable of leading the working class millions and all the laboring people. A party is invincible if it is able, as Lenin says, to link itself with, to keep in close touch with, and, to a certain extent if you like, to merge with the broadest masses of the toilers, primarily with the proletariat, but also with the non-proletarian toiling masses. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 25, page 174. A party perishes if it shuts itself up in its narrow party shell, if it severs itself from the masses, if it allows itself to be covered with bureaucratic rust. We may take it as the rule, Comrade Stalin says, that as long as the Bolsheviks maintain connection with the broad masses of the people they will be invincible. And, on the contrary, as soon as the Bolsheviks sever themselves from the masses and lose their connection with them, as soon as they become covered with bureaucratic rust, they will lose all their strength and become a mere cipher. In the mythology of the ancient Greeks there was a celebrated hero, Antaeus, who, so the legend goes, was the son of Poseidon, god of the seas, and Gaia, goddess of the earth. Antaeus was very much attached to the mother who had given birth to him, suckled him and reared him. There was not a hero whom this Antaeus did not vanquish. He was regarded as an invincible hero. Wherein lay his strength? It lay in the fact that every time he was hard-pressed in a fight with an adversary he would touch the earth, the mother who had given birth to him and suckled him, and that gave him new strength. Yet he had a vulnerable spot, the danger of being detached from the earth in some way or other. His enemies were aware of this weakness and watched for him. One day an enemy appeared who took advantage of this vulnerable spot and vanquished Antaeus. This was Hercules. How did Hercules vanquish Antaeus? He lifted him from the earth, kept him suspended in the air, prevented him from touching the earth, and throttled him. I think that the Bolsheviks remind us of the hero of Greek. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution mythology, Antaeus. They, like Antaeus, are strong because they maintain connection with their mother, the masses, who gave birth to them, suckled them and reared them. And as long as they maintain connection with their mother, with the people, they have every chance of remaining invincible. That is the key to the invincibility of Bolshevik leadership. J. Stalin, Mastering Bolshevism, pp. 58-60. Such are the chief lessons to be drawn from the historical path traversed by the Bolshevik Party. Glossary. Decembrists. Revolutionaries of the nobility who were opposed to the autocratic monarchy and serfdom. They organized an unsuccessful revolt in December 1825. Manilovism. Smug complacency, inactivity, feudal daydreaming, from Manilov, a character in Gogol's Dead Souls. Okhrana, secret political police department in Tsarist Russia, formed to combat the revolutionary movement. Nepman, a private manufacturer, trader, or profiteer in the early period of the new economic policy, NEP. Technical minimum, minimum level of technical knowledge required of workers in socialist industry. Trudoviki, a petty bourgeois group formed in 1906 consisting of part of the peasant members of the First State Duma headed by socialist revolutionary intellectuals. Boribists, left wing of the Ukrainian Social Revolutionaries, a chauvinist nationalist party. Until 1918 they published a central organ known as Borodba. Zemsky Nashalnik, an official with police, magisterial and administrative functions appointed from the nobility. Zemsky Sobor, an assembly of representatives of the estates convened in Russia in the 16th and 17th centuries to deliberate with the government. 364.